Ladies and gentlemen, episode 9. Woo! And we have another totally random, don't know him from Adam, walked the stranger off the street into my home guest. And it was epic. Stranger, danger? Nah. The only risk he's posing is changing your mind. That intro kind of sums up the second half of this episode. This turned out to be a pretty sick episode, to be fair. As I said, didn't know him at all. Met him at the pull-up bars outside my house. Got chatting to him. Turns out he also runs a podcast. I'm like, oh, deja vu. I said, look, I'm stuck for a guest. What are you doing Wednesday? He goes, bro, I got you. I was like, alright, let's go. So, Ciaran O'Regan is his name, and he's a very nice gentleman from Limerick who's now living in Cork. 2 days later, Wednesday, boom, connected up, Savage podcast. He's a sports scientist, so the first half of the podcast, we kind of just sort of got to know each other. It's very much an interesting interaction because we don't know each other. And so it's a fascinating example of where two people create something fascinating over a relatively short space of time. And this shows how you can navigate a conversation. It's actually an interesting example of how you can use relatively benign and almost small talk topics such as your job, what you studied, or where you grew up, or what hobbies you have, etc. And you can build it into something more. And that's what we did. So the first hour is kind of like two intellectual dogs sniffing around the proverbial butthole of the other until you kind of realize, okay, well, he hasn't bitten me yet, and the next thing we're all playing fetch. And one's throwing the idea and the other one's going chasing and bringing it back with another concept, and it's just built into something fun. So the second half of the podcast, kind of the last hour and a half, we kind of fell into loosely existential risks to society. And what existential risk is, it is essentially the potential for something to eradicate either entirely or a large swathe of, in this case, human existence as we know. So it's a branch of philosophy, but doesn't matter. So we fall more down into this interesting category where we look at things like AI and capitalism and the structures that we build for ourselves and the structures of belief and how we sort of position ourselves as the center of the universe. But when it comes to solving any of life's problems, all of a sudden we're no play in it. And there's a very crucial part at the end where we work our way through what the individual can do to make life better. Because we always hear people complaining, life's this, life's that. Oh, child labour is wrong, but I'm not going to buy my branded clothes just because it's wrong. And oh, well, I'm against human trafficking, but I'm not going to stop watching porn just because that's where a huge amount of the sex trafficking comes into play. And so we've got all these weird sort of paradoxes where we're against things while at the same time acting as if we support them. And so we look into the individual and how the individual can play a crucial role. And it's a very important piece now. And it will become a separate video that will be available to be shared. There's lots of little fun topics get thrown over and back. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed making it. I've been told my intros go on too long, so I have to rein it all back and shave off half my existence just to keep the people happy. It's called Rambleland. But no, even in Rambleland you can't ramble too much. I'm joking, obviously. I do tend to waffle unbearably, and I don't notice it half the time. So, conscious decision here, nice short. Ciaran is the guest. I don't know him. We have a good conversation. We talk about physical activity and crazy things that could kill us all. I hope you enjoy it. Rambleland, episode 9 with Ciaran O'Regan. So, Ciaran, how are we getting on, sir? Thank you very much for coming on. So, just a little filler inner. You were again one of those beautiful random people that just appeared to me only this week. I was at the pull-up bars and a group of 3 were over there and they had a speaker going and they were they had the speaker going. It was kind of low. It went up. Hey guys, can we turn up the speaker? And you guys like, absolutely, no problem. We can do that for you. And then we just kind of got chatting and we began to realize then not only did we have similarities in our thoughts, but we actually knew people we knew the same people, and realized then there was something more here, and I was stuck for a guest this week, and then boom, I sprung up this conversation with yourself, and now we're here. So if you wouldn't mind telling people a little bit about yourself, obviously now, because I don't actually know anything about you personally, so today is going to be both a research session and hopefully enlightening conversation. There we go.
It's always where to begin. I suppose I'll start with my profession and work backwards. I suppose is I living here in Cork, work as a strength coach and a conditioning coach, mostly working with teams, and I also do online coaching with a company called Sigma Nutrition. And what I do with Sigma is I specialize in working with fighters to help fighters make weight for fights, and then not just make weight, obviously, but make weight in such a way that they can get into a cage and swing fists and shins and such at each other the following day or a few hours later. And I do strength and conditioning stuff with some of these fighters as well. With regards to my background, then I come from did a degree in sports science in UL, finished there in 2012, and while I was in college, I'd taken up because of a coaching placement I did with the Irish boxing team a few times. A few periods of a few days at a time with the Irish boxing team that I did as kind of almost like an unofficial internship kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. And as a result of what I saw there and how impressed I was with the way that they trained, I just couldn't believe what I was seeing in terms of what the way. This was 2010-ish, 2010. And this was so like a lot of the Olympians from 2008 that did so well were still around, and the ones that went on to 2012, so Katie Taylor was around, and then other ones like Paddy Barnes and Kenny Egan, and these lads they were still around. They were there, or they were either after the 2008 or getting ready for the 2012 Olympics and qualifying, all this stuff. So I saw this, and I come from a rugby background, and I just loved hard training, and I wasn't playing rugby at the time, and I just like, fucking hell, this is different. I've never seen anything like this before. I need a taste of this.
This was the boxing now. The boxing sort of hooked your interests.
Yeah, I just saw how they were training and how they prepared, and the level of intensity and just everything about it was just so impressive to me in so many different respects. And I was a fan of fight sports for years. It's like I'd done some martial arts as a kid. I'd done some kickboxing as a kid, as a teenager, bits and pieces, and I was a long time UFC fan. And it's 2010 before MMA really blew up in Ireland, so there was bits of MMA around the place, of course, and I dabbled in a little bit of MMA training as a teenager as well, but just being exposed to this boxing was just something else altogether in terms of what was available at the time. Maybe if it was nowadays, maybe I would have ventured into different, but regardless, I took up boxing anyway, quite old, like 20, nearly 21, I think, when I started. Okay. And did that while I was in college, and then did it for a few years after. And then basically since finishing college in 2012, I've been working as a strength coach, and I was fighting, and I kept fighting kind of competitively. Then I switched sports from boxing to kind of looking to get into MMA in 2016, I'd say. And done like Muay Thai, K1 kickboxing, and jiu-jitsu, and I competed in jiu-jitsu once and competed in K1 kickboxing in 2017. And then I just decided, and then I just kind of a series of I suppose realizations I had around then, and I kind of realized that I was done with fighting, and I'd kind of gotten out of it what I wanted to get out of it as a competitor. And so then I stopped fighting in 2017. And
what was that exactly? What were you satisfied that you'd gotten out of it?
My reasons for continuing no longer justified what it took to do.
Okay.
So I took it very, very seriously in terms of like my preparations. So this is going straight into the deep end here in terms of psychologically, but
go for it.
I had a lot of difficulty early on in boxing in terms of trying to figure out the mind and how to manage the mind, or how to approach fighting from a mental perspective, such that I could get to these places where I could just get out of my own way and just let my body do its thing and perform.
Mm-hmm.
Just kind of to kind of be able to flick that switch that was kind of just fighting. And because there's a point, like, you know, there's this Bruce Lee thing of, like, when you first start off, a kick is just a kick, and then after a while you realize that there's all this nuance and technical precision to the kick, and there's all these specific movement patterns, and there's all these shades of gray, and then eventually you come all the way back around at a certain point to a kick being just a kick again. And that's what like with me fighting is, like, when I first got into fighting, it was just get into it, get in there, get stuck in, and then I almost kind of got in my own way by approaching fighting almost too because I was so into the craft of the sport. I was almost too trying to be too intellectually in control of what was happening in terms of how I was, what I was doing in there. And then eventually I managed to kind of come back around to a stage where a fight was just a fight again. And it's when I managed to get back to that place again after going around this full circle that and how I'd managed to overcome that. Obviously, there's all different skills and everything, but how I'd managed to get to this place of being able to just let it go and get into a ring such that, or a cage or a ring, whatever I was fighting in, that this again, deep end, but like I fought in such a way that if I died, it was grand, and if he died, it was grand. It was fighting in such a way that there wasn't winners and losers. There was a mentality of winners and dead fellas. Of like, because that was the only way, because I was so aware of the long-term repercussions of trauma and damage and brain damage and all these. I was aware of this stuff. So then the way that I managed to stay engaged with the sport and take the sport seriously enough that I was able to prepare in such a way that I mitigated the likelihood of experiencing any of these traumas in terms of how I prepared, how I trained, how I approached sparring practices, how I approached my own technical acquisition and technical refinement and skill acquisition. Was I approached it based on, there was a book that I come across years ago, like in my first year or two in boxing, I came across this book because of a Joe Rogan podcast. Actually, there was a Joe Rogan guest called Sam Sheridan. And he wrote this book, a number of books, but he wrote one particular book called The Fighter's Mind that I read. And in that book, it's basically him traveling around America, interviewing, and I think it was all around America, interviewing really famous fighters or people involved in fighting. And one of them, they were all fighters, and there was one ultra runner. But one of the chapters was a guy called Virgil Hunter, who is Andre Ward's boxing coach. And Andre Ward, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he's one of the best super middleweight, light heavyweight boxers ever. And he's maybe pound for pound one at the top. He's almost like a super middleweight, light heavyweight kind of Floyd Mayweather kind of equivalent. The way he approached fighting and his skills and everything was so good. And Olympic champion as well. And Virgil Hunter in that book, this is when a kind of a switch flicked for me, and a kind of seeds were planted, or maybe it was around 2013 or 14, but maybe around 2013ish maybe. I read this book, and this planted seeds that came to fruition in maybe 2017. Which was in the book, there was a reference to this guy called Miyamoto Musashi, who was a Japanese swordsman. Who, long story short, Musashi was a masterless swordsman who essentially traveled around Japan training by himself mostly, and then trying to find people to fight to the death. So that was like a thing that they did in 1600s Japan. It's like 1500, 1600 Japan. He's just traveling. He was just like a traveling bum. He dedicated his whole life to the way of the sword at a very young, in his like teens and 20s. And he ended up I think winning like 62 duels one-on-one, and essentially, and then retiring undefeated, and then them going on to still, but then what was also interesting, but before I went off tangent, he had in his book, he and his book were referenced in this boxing chapter of this book, A Fighter's Mind. And the way Virgil Hunter trained his fighters was along this line of, he trained them with full respect for boxing. He trained his boxers as if they were samurai training to fight to the death in a sword fight.
Mm-hmm.
So to him, because, and then that resonated with me, because it kind of, it was like to me, well, people do die in boxing fights. It happens regularly. Maybe like lots of times every year. I can't remember the exact stats, but lots of times every year people die in fights, in boxing matches, Muay Thai fights, kickboxing fights, MMA fights.
Is it as frequent as that?
Yeah, it's really regular in boxing. We just don't hear about it because they're all over the world. It could be like a small show in Mexico, another small show in Thailand, another small show in. We hear about it maybe if it's a big TV show. Yeah. There'd be hundreds and hundreds of professional boxing shows on in like community centers in Brazil and shit. You know, that they're just like, they're pro boxers, but they're not. It's not televised and stuff. But so anyway, that's the way he approached it. Was he trained his fighters as if it was of the utmost consequence. And that's the way he described it. Because of that, he was influenced by a Book of Five Rings by Musashi. So then I got into that. And then that planted seeds. And then eventually, by the time those seeds came to fruition, was what then became my last fight. So then, because it was after that last fight, I had all these other plans and different things I was aiming for and reasons I was doing it. And then after the last fight, there was just kind of this, I'd won the fight. I picked up a few niggles, but nothing crazy. Like I had some injuries that were not... I was going to be sidelined for a short period of time. Like I broke my ribs and I had maybe a broken foot as well that I never got checked out. But I ended up, but they weren't going to keep me out of it for a while. And I didn't take any major shots to the head or any damage. But I had this kind of this sense of this kind of a shadow over my head for a number of weeks after the fight. And I couldn't figure out why, because everything had gone to plan. It's like the fight worked out. The training was phenomenal. The weight cut was brilliant. The performance was good because it had these ups and downs, and eventually kind of in the performance, things kind of came right. And it was all these positives, but then there was like this sense of like, what the fuck is going on? And then it was chatting to some friends about a month after the fight. I just kind of said it out loud, or I was just kind of rambling a bit when we were out for a walk on a beach out in Myrtleville. And I just kind of said it. I said, I think I'm done with fighting. And then as soon as I said those words, it was like this big weight lifted off my shoulders. And it was like that shadow, the cloud just disappeared. And the dark cloud just disappeared instantaneous. As soon as I said those words, it was gone. It was like just weight off my shoulders. And so that's kind of why. It was like, I know, because, and then in retrospect, it was that I kind of realized that my whys for continuing no longer justified what it took to put my own health at risk or my opponent's health at risk. Like I could no longer justify going in there trying to essentially kill my opposition, and also being aware that he's doing the same. He's trying to do the same to me, or at least treating it as if he's doing the same to me, such that, because that allowed me to treat the sport with the utmost respect that I think it deserved. Like combat sports, full contact combat sports they're on the edge of what we can call sport, realistically. It's like, there's like, because the intent is to inflict harm. It's not like, someone's intent in rugby might be at certain points to hurt someone with a tackle. Yeah. But in combat sport, you win the fight in a striking match by either inflicting more harm on them than they inflict on you, or by hurting them in such a way that they're not able to continue. So yeah, that's kind of why I'd stopped, basically. Short story long, maybe.
Okay, interesting. Because you said the training patterns as well between the boxing and the rugby was struck a chord or two. So first of all, where did you play ball? Were you playing rugby around Limerick?
Yeah. I played schools rugby with Munchin's College, and then I played club rugby with clubs, a couple of clubs in Limerick, St. Mary's Rugby Club and Young Munsters Rugby Club.
You hardly know Tom Shine, do you?
No.
What age are yourself? What age actually are you?
I'm 31, turned 31.
Okay, no, he's 27, so you would have been a few years ahead of him. Okay.
What about yourself, man?
I'm only 23.
But and your own, I suppose, to give me some context, so I'm in the same situation as yourself.
That's actually true. Yeah, that's true.
What's your deal like? What's your
So in terms of physical activities, I would have grown up playing rugby from probably under 8s, maybe under 10s. And I would have played club, then played schools for 5 years, and then went back playing club, and then went back playing college. And in between these sessions, there would have been spats of jiu-jitsu, a little bit of boxing. I tried to do a Tenze Kale. It's just like a hand-to-hand self-defense thing down in Waterford. I just wanted that for a few weeks. And I dabbled with a lot of sort of fighting sports, but I never committed to them because in my head, rugby was the main one. But the problem was, as I kept getting injured. So I have dislocated the shoulder in second year. So I dislocated my shoulder and shattered my humerus in the one motion in second year. And that injury plagued me then for the next 8-9 years. And it still plagues me. So I've had 2 big surgeries on my shoulder. And as a result, I tend to... So after the second surgery was meant to stabilize the shoulder permanently. It didn't. I don't know what went wrong with the surgery, whether my post-op recovery, I just didn't give it enough attention. I was distracted at the time. I remember I got that surgery just before I came to college, and I ended up being on crutches then 6 weeks out of surgery. And so the shoulder was getting buckled again on the crutches. And I think that actually played a long-term factor in the destabilization of the shoulder post-surgery. But what would happen was I'd go into rugby after a shoulder. So the shoulder's come out. It's come out 6 times. So I go back to ball, play for half a season, get injured, miss the last half of the season. After being injured, being like, I'm not going back to rugby. It's too taxing on me. I have to, every time I get injured, I can't go to work. It's affecting too much. It's giving me long-term problems. So I have a constant click in the shoulder. I've got scar tissue that prevents it moving in certain directions. I'm sacrificing physically too much for the sport. But then you give me 3, 4, 5 months off. You give me all my rehab, and the next thing I'm itching to get back out, and I'm itching to feel the grass under my feet. And as a result, then I kept going back to it. And then an interesting point, though, where you mentioned about getting in your own way was I loved rugby, and I really wanted to be good at rugby, but I was terrible at it. And I actually was. And looking back, I realized I was terrible at it. I enjoyed certain positions, but I didn't have the brain for rugby. And this was the big thing, was that at that age, I think I'm kind of a slow developer in general, physically, mentally, a lot of other ways. And so while I was in rugby and people were explaining to me, and like a good friend now, he's playing professional ball, Bill Johnson, and I remember him sitting down before the Senior Cup and writing out the plays. Now we're talking maybe 2-3 weeks before Senior Cup rugby starts. And he's like, lad, how do you not have this? So writing down our plays, this play goes here, da. And even when he'd show me things like crossing and he'd explain the ins and outs of the moves, mentally I go, yeah, I know what that means, but I didn't understand the concept of switches. I didn't understand the concept of timing it perfectly so that when that ball hits your hands, you're actually hidden by the player you're switching with. And as a result, I actually got in my own way a lot by not understanding the moves, and I never did very well at rugby. And it was only then as I got older, and particularly when into college, I wanted to go back to rugby just for the enjoyment of it. And I said, no, I'm just going to enjoy this. I'm just going to see what happens. And would you believe I played probably the best season I've ever put down in number 8, playing J2 rugby with UCC. And one of the things I stopped doing was I stopped not hyping myself up before games, but trying to play out how this match was going to go in my head. Because I think all through school rugby, I was very much like, right, I'm going to get the ball, I'm going to do this step, and I'm going to go in for the try, and okay, I'm going to do it. I tried all these sort of stupid techniques of playing it through in your head, and I'd take my Baraka boost, and I'd be all headphones on, trying to get in the zone. And then college ball came along, I ditched all that. Sometimes I'd be landing onto training, I'd be landing onto game day after either working during the day or doing college work all day, and it was literally 10 minutes before I was supposed to get ready, I just get my bits and I go. Next thing I know, I was out on the pitch and playing a savage game of rugby. And then looking back, I realized where I was going wrong in school ball. And I always wondered now if I could go back now, kill it. Now, hopefully I could still be 23 and all the other lads be 14. I can just play through them. But I realized mentally where I was going wrong. And so then I tried to take that approach into jiu-jitsu. And I began to really try and play through the movements in jiu-jitsu in my head. Outside of training, I'd be like, okay, with the omoplata, my hand goes here and that goes there, leg comes around, and then, okay, getting them in guard. And I try and play through the positions in my head so that when I was actually on the mats, when I ended up in a position, it felt familiar to me. And there wasn't this point of, right, I'm getting crushed here. Okay, this is uncomfortable. And I'd be trying to like, what do I do now? It was like, okay, so this is what happens just before I go into this move. So now just take a second, control the breathing. All right, now move again. And I was a bit hit and miss with jiu-jitsu. Again, injuries kept putting me out of training. But every time I went back, I felt I caught back up to where I was previously faster than I had the time before, and etc. And I felt then I was kind of developing a little bit. And I was just really picking up the momentum with the jiu-jitsu then before lockdown 1 started. And then in between lockdown 1 and 2. And so as a result then, you know, once again, the steam was taken out of the sails. There's not a huge amount anyone can really do about that, because there's a lot of people much worse off. There's, like, I actually know recovered alcoholics who the gym was their outlet and their means of staying clean, and that's been taken away from them. They're in a lot worse position than I am, because I'm familiar with this bouncing in and out of sports. So I'm not complaining that just as I was getting the momentum up, it's taken from me. But also then in line with that, I was always very much into the gym, and the gym has always been my sort of core mental medicine. As much as I get into other sports, is one thing I can't ever see me walking away from is from the weights. And I was explaining that to you the other day. Like, I've started doing calisthenic movements, and I have the gymnastic rings, and I'm exploring with other sort of strength-based workouts, and I'm really enjoying them. But that craving to be back under just iron and just feel it, the gym is just something else for me anyway. When I've got my headphones in and that cup of coffee I had before is just pumping, and I can feel the tingling in my fingers, and I've got some euphoric hard style pumping away in the back of my head. The gym for me it's where a lot of my mental healing takes place.
Yeah, it's like the gym, like strength training for me over the years. Like, I've been doing it more than half my life now. I've been doing it 15, 16 years. I started doing, like, 14 maybe years old. I started doing push-ups and sit-ups on my bedroom floor as a young fella, and then got a chin-up bar, and then got one of those like weight sets with the spinny things at the end of the bar.
Yeah. I had a bench like that.
All that stuff. So yeah, but strength training for me is always like, it's like going to mass. You know, it's like my mass, like that kind of a thing. It's like, so it's like it's like worshipping the gains. You know, it's like this that feeling, that strength work. There's just something that becomes very addictive about it.
Did you ever have a problem with your ego when you were lifting?
Oh yeah, because you just get you definitely there's because it's like trying to find that balance where, when it comes to strength work or any form of training, I think a really important lesson that people can learn is to realize the difference between building strength and testing strength, or building any capacity and testing that capacity. They're different things. Okay. So the same way that I'd approach a session in which I was trying to find out where I was, it's not how I'd approach a session where I was trying to lay bricks towards a future wall.
Okay.
It's like, because there's a big difference between testing capacities and building capacities. And when those things, when there's a kind of a murkiness, like it always, even when we're building capacities, there's still going to be feedback that's letting us know how we're doing. Because let's say last week I do 3 sets of 5 reps with 120 kilos on a bench, and there was 3-4 minutes between break roughly, and the hardest of those sets was about 2.5 reps left in the bank. You know, I use something like that, like RPE, like reps in reserve, or RPE. Let's say I hit, okay, the first set was about 3 reps left in the bank. The second set was maybe 2, sometimes between 2 and 3.
Yeah.
The third set was definitely 2 reps left in the bank, but I wouldn't have done 3. Then next week if I do the same weight for the same reps and they're a little bit easier, then that's progress. So there's my finger on the pulse a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But my ego would get in the way is where in the past I'd think, oh, I have to put more weight on the bar this week, or I have to do more reps this week, or I'm training with some mates of mine and I have to kind of demonstrate how strong I am. I have to like show off or something, like, and that kind of shallow
ego lifting,
chimp insecurity, you know. It's like that's definitely been problematic. Thankfully, not as much anymore, because I can spot it and keep it in check. You know? And it's actually a nice thing about the calisthenics training that I've been doing mostly, is because the calisthenics training is there's much more of a skill element to it, maybe, because as you get stronger, you don't necessarily, because progression or increased difficulty needs to either come from, there's loads of variables you can manipulate. Like, you could do more reps with the same movement over the same range of motion, or you can do the same reps with different tempo, or you could do the same reps in the same sets with shorter duration rest or whatever. There's fucking loads of ways. But for the most part, it involves needing to continually learn new progressions and regressions. So we're constantly learning new movements as opposed to doing the same movement with either more or less weight, as a really basic. And then that kind of reality to it, I found, is really useful at making the training really focused on quality rather than focused on, because it's not about how much weight is on the bar or what dumbbells are in my hand, you know. So I found that really useful element of being able to build this mindset around quality reps that's kind of treating the craft of the movement and the quality of the movement. So
and that concept there of quality reps is a big one, because it's one of the problems. Like, out of control egos in the gym is a massive issue, particularly even with PTs who have other people looking up to them and maybe even training with them, and as a result, the ego that the PT may have is rubbing off on the client. Because I noticed, like, ego used to be a big thing for me, and I didn't know it was my ego at the time. And you'll see from, like, my Instagram, I was sort of striving to be one of those sort of, how do I say it without cutting the back off them all, wanker, without realizing what I was doing and what I was sacrificing really about my personality. And trying to be going around the gym with the tightest tank top you could imagine, and checking myself out in the mirror and making noises, and like going up and changing the music and stupid things like this. And well, first of all, what it did was it leaves you, it's just not fulfilling, and it leaves you always wanting more and always looking around and seeing, well, what are other people doing? And it took a little. Now, it was, you see, this is the weird thing, because it was a lot of fun. And so I can understand why people get into it and why people never even realize it. It's, you actually reference this, and we'll come back to this. The essay that you sent me on was you used the story of the older fish swimming past the younger fish and going, "Hello, lads, how's the water?" And they swim past and they're just like, "What the hell is water?" You know, when you're in the middle of it and the ego's throbbing, but you're surrounded by people who are also as egotistical as you don't realize it. But when I moved away from that sort of the gym approach and went back to just doing what I wanted, doing how I felt on the day, training for what I needed, whether that be physically or mentally, I began to then really cherish my moments in the gym. And there'd be days where I'd be sitting in the gym, and again, music plays a big factor with me. And obviously a good caffeine rush beforehand, where I'm sitting on the gym and I'm thinking about the events that have gone on in personal life and in this, that, and the other. And I well up, and I actually get emotional, and I can feel this, and I can feel my eyes sort of burning as if I want to sort of start crying. But it's not in a depressed, miserable sense. It's almost euphoric. It was a very distinguished sense of, I'm happy right now. In this moment, I'm alive. I feel good. And as a result now, like, my relationship with gym is significantly improved, and I do very much my own exercises, and I don't follow the bro splits anymore. and I don't follow generic workouts. I find alternative fellas on Instagram who look for functional strength. It was, hang on now, there was someone said, I think it was Ross Edgley. So we'll come back to Ross Edgley too, because I've been looking at him recently. But he says, your body should be an instrument, not an ornament. And that was like, that was a big one. Like, and a lot of bodies we see these days are ornaments. And this is a problem as well, is that you see with a lot of PTs, they're focusing on fat loss and being lean and being the biggest in the gym or whatever. But these aren't what being fit is. And if we could sort of switch the mentality here, where you should be going gym so that you're athletic, that you're strong, that you're healthy, that when you fall over, you don't break bones. If you have to get into an altercation, you actually have a bit of upper body strength. You're not just in this rigid, single plane motions, and everything that sort of comes along with changing your approach to why you're going to the gym. Because traditionally it was to prepare people for, to keep men fit during times of peace and just staying strong. And it's only really in the last, I'm crossing the lines there. Sport was introduced to keep men fit during peace times. The gym is an interesting one. Have you ever looked into the history of the gym? Because it's only in the last sort of 100 or so years certainly in the last 60 years that it's gained the sort of following that it has, that we see at the minute.
Sorry, you froze there for a second. I think I got the question. Did you ask, have you ever looked into the history of the gym and in the last 100 or so years? I was familiar to a very shallow extent to the history of strength training, with just bits and pieces I'd read about over the years. And then much more recently, over the last year or two, there's a really good podcast called Iron Culture, and it's run by this guy Eric Helms and this other lad Omar Isuf. And Eric is in particular someone who's had a massive influence on me over the years. Like, he's written some brilliant books on strength training and nutrition called The Muscle and Strength Pyramids, and they've been extremely useful at conceptualizing a lot of the kind of hierarchy of importance of certain components of certain principles involved in strength training and nutrition as it relates to muscle gain and fat loss, etc. And strength gain. And they've in this podcast, Iron Culture, it's either called Iron Culture Podcast or Iron Culture Radio. It might be called Iron Culture Podcast. It's all on YouTube anyway, and all the major apps. It's really good. But they have people on talking about the history and like the old school, like physical culturalists from the mid to late 19th century and around Europe, and people like Eugene Sandow that the Olympia bodybuilding trophy is named after. And it's really interesting hearing that kind of history of it, because these muscle men, like you mentioned, the Ross Edgley quote was really good, like, was an instrument, not an ornament. Yeah. These original muscle men were freakish. There was freakish strength, and also they were jacked massively, but also they were gymnasts, like hand balancing, really like demonstrating, like just physically very well-rounded in terms of their strength and movement control and what they were into. And how they developed their physique was through lifting odd objects, lifting makeshift weights, gymnastic, calisthenics training, hand balancing, hand walking, all sorts of stuff like that. It was it's really cool to think back and then compare that to, I suppose, like I know people who've done bodybuilding and who've competed in bodybuilding and have massive respect for the discipline and the level of, like, even to call it discipline is almost it's undershoot. Yeah. What especially what natural bodybuilders who don't have pharmaceutical assistance, what they have to do to be able to get to those levels of body fat still maintain that muscle mass. It's the level of detail and precision in training and nutrition, lifestyle management. It's an entire, their whole life has to be dedicated towards it. Like, there's no, because you literally wear your sport, and and there's no getting out of it. So that's kind of my back, and I'm aware that calisthenics training goes right back to it's been, I think the first place that it ever been recorded was actually at that historic kind of the stories written by the Persians around the battle with the Spartans in the gates of Thermopylae, that the spies or the scouts that were sent to kind of have a look and see what the Spartans were doing, because how many of them there were and what they were doing. You know, that the movie 300 is based on. That gates of Thermopylae, that the Persian scouts who were going to sneak and have a look and check out what they were doing wrote about them doing what they thought like some kind of weird dances and stuff, and it was actually calisthenics and strength work with their just moving around. So it goes back a long time.
That's very interesting, because that also sparked the idea in the back of my head, is that like the old sort of martial arts in Asian culture, like even what became the ninjas and all those sort of hand-to-hand, that's all calisthenics work. That's all lifting the body and it's all its different motions, and knowing obviously how to destroy the body in a variety of different positions. But the other thing with calisthenics, so I know the other thing with calisthenics,
good to go there for something happened.
I paused there when I saw my screen freeze, and so I just said I'd pick it up when the screen copped itself on. I don't know what it is, because my internet now is still saying I'm still green on my internet. Anyway,
I'm going to see if I can connect to a different Wi-Fi.
Okay, no problem.
Here we go.
Savage. Comfortable seat now as well.
Yeah, sorted, man.
A1, thank you.
Where were we?
So yeah, I was just about to mention that the other thing with calisthenics is that one thing it does, especially if you come from bodybuilding or from just this sort of egotistical lifting, it humbles you. Because when you come on and you try and do any of the calisthenics movements, you realize then how useless having lumps and lumps and lumps of muscle is when it comes to raw strength and the ability to move your body in particular directions, and especially at speed. And that was one thing that when you come into calisthenics and you watch YouTube videos and you're like, that looks easy, I could do that. Woo! Like, I couldn't even hold myself on a bar for longer than 10, 15 seconds without the hands just slowly crawling open. And now the grips come a lot better, but I still can't do genuine false grip. I can't hold a false grip position. There's a load of other things then with calisthenics that just shatters you and put you back on the bottom rung of the ladder. And so when you watch, like there's a fella, I think he's 52, and he comes to those pull-up bars that we were at the other day, and he walks on his hands around the perimeter of that little park comfortably, 50-something years of age, no problem. I can't even hold myself in a handstand, never mind walk around on my hands with that sort of agility. And that's another lovely thing about calisthenics, is that it's a whole new skill to have to learn and get your stabilizers activated and strengthened up.
And everything is full body. Like even when you do a push up, and you kind of you dial in the position where like the back isn't broken into a kind of a big, just like your core is actually, your torso muscles, core muscles are actually switched on such that the back isn't broken into a big arch, and you're actually engaged in such that you're able to do, you're fully engaged with the ground and a push up in both your hands and your feet. Everything you're just, whereas if I could, it's much easier to be on, like if I'm bench pressing and I'm doing it technically with technical precision, it is a full body movement because I'm a leg drive and I'm tense and everything. But it is possible to bench press in a way that everything is just loose and floppy, and I'm just kind of, whereas with something like a push up, you can't do it and avoid the fact that your whole body is engaged. So there's a kind of an element of like, just by necessity, you're forced to kind of figure out where your limbs are in space, that you can't, there's less room for kind of laxity in terms of developing physical awareness with the calisthenics, that makes it kind of a really, it's just the skill acquisition. Some people don't get much of a kick off it. Some people I know just love shifting weight, and because they're just used to certain feelings and used to wanting to lift more weight, or there's just a certain different buzz. Like, and I've gone in and out of different phases between them. But
the pump as well. The pump is another aspect about lifting weights that is harder to get on in calisthenics workouts. Now, it does come, but it doesn't come to the same balloon effect that a hard chest and arms day will do to you. You know, even when you go to brush your teeth sometimes at night, your arms are falling off you, and the DOMs feel a bit more intense. And it's hard to build the same sort of intensity with the calisthenics. And the other reason for that is because calisthenics, you fail a lot faster. So your ligaments and your tendons fatigue so much quicker than when you're just bicep curling a low weight for lots of reps. And you think you'll be able for it, but after 2 or 3 or 4 gymnastic ring pull-ups, your arms are getting tired, your shoulders are getting tired, and you're like, what have I been lifting weights for the last 3 years to do? Like, I can't understand how simple movements don't work. And like, going back to your point there with the press-ups, the other thing with the press-up is that you can see very clearly that the form is wrong, because when people aren't doing press-ups correctly, you almost have that worm effect where their head and their chest comes up, and then maybe their ass follows them, and then they kind of flop back down, and there's that same sort of weird motion back up, and it's
kind of a floppy.
Even they know they're not doing it right. But with bench, for example, I see fellas lifting crazy weight, 3-4 plates either side, and I know that they're not technically doing it accurate, but you can get away with that because you can very much just focus on that chest engagement, and you see the little wobble of the hips over and back because they're not stable. And it was when I started correcting my form on those sort of movements, or squat is another one, or incline press. Incline press was one where I realized my form was terrible, and driving your heels in, you realize, oh, my core is actually seriously weak, because it's actually very hard to hold yourself in a rigid position when there's a lot of weight moving on one half of your body than the other.
Yeah, and there's massive technical nuance to any of the barbell lifts, but part of maybe what's happened, so it was in that, like, I particularly enjoy the technique involved in benching, like flat bench, like, because I trained, the best gym I've ever trained in is my mate's place in Limerick, and I'm definitely biased because he's a very good mate of mine, but it's also the best gym I've ever been in. It's called City Gym in Limerick, and it's a powerlifting gym, and the equipment, the buzz, everything about it, the space itself is unbelievable. It's and I spent a lot of time training there over the years, so I spent a lot of time training with very strong powerlifters that I learned a lot from, and got sent down some interesting avenues in terms of the understanding of strength and how strength works, how it's developed, and it's like, it's this thing, like you mentioned earlier on, it's there's an element of it just being part of, not part of, but there's once someone, I think, is in the strength game for enough time to realize that there's this control that they can have over the development of their body, and the progress that they can make, and be able to change the shape of the body, and to be able to get also the kind of buzz from seeing improvements, the kind of self-mastery of seeing improvements with more weight or more reps, and with the combination of, because we're all primates that, like, I know very few people that don't know any that don't like the idea of being happy with themselves naked. You know, that there's a reality to just the physical, that having a sense of being able to manipulate our physical form in a way that maybe we become, and there's a line that can be crossed, of course, where people can have, let's say, these things that are classified as disorders, like body dysmorphic stuff, or eating disorder stuff, or where there's an obsession, or where someone has this idea that when I get X, when I have a six pack that looks like this for that, then I'll be happy. And there's definitely a reality there to dysfunctional approach to the physical side in terms of aesthetics.
Yes.
But But inside of that, there can also be a healthy relationship with just being confident in one's own skin. And
this is a big thing that people should be picking up on, is then the flip side is of being, so you've got egotistical at the one end of the spectrum, and then the other side is these people who hate other people who are in good shape, and who don't understand why there's this gym obsession going on at the minute. But it actually stretches back as well to Stoicism. You see like these great minds who also had fantastic bodies and fantastic feats of strength, and mind and body were connected back then, and the two were seen to be linked. And like a lot of times nowadays, you see there's a bit of a disconnection. You assume when you hear about an intellectual that they may be slim, or soft hands and very delicate, maybe aren't very strong or physically active. And then you've got the gym junkie, the all brawn, no brains. And it's very rare to find someone in between the two. But one place you do find a lot of those in-between people is in UFC and in MMA and these cage fighting sports, where the intensity and the tempo is very demanding, and the risk is quite high. Because as you were saying, the risk of death, that warfare mentality that you're going in to fight this opponent. And if it wasn't for a ref and the crowd and the situation you're in, it would have been a fight to the death. It would have been that samurai challenging people to the duel, because to defend your manhood and to bolster yourself up. And so it's slowly, the bridge is joined slowly between intellectuals and physical specimens in a positive way, and a way that I hope will continue, because one of the things that will do if you open your mind to external forces in terms of like influence or inspiration from Stoicism and stuff, is that it will help to curb your ego, because you will then put yourself in amongst the framework of who is stronger and who is weaker, and that it's okay to be on any lane of this, because what matters is your motivations behind the gym and what you're getting from it and how you're utilizing the gym. And is it making you better or worse a person? Because it ties the two. So you can no longer just rely on the gym to be your personality, and you can forget about, having a personality, having human relation skills, and actually being a nice person all around. Things like Stoicism throw that back in your face. So the two have to be linked, which
there's
is a positive change.
That lad that I mentioned earlier on, the swordsman Musashi, there's quite a few similarities between Stoicism and the kind of Zen Buddhism that the samurai adopted and practiced, Japanese swordsmen. So like with regards to Musashi, for example, one of the lines from A Book of Five Rings was that he said, the way of the warrior is the twofold path of the pen and the sword, and he should have a taste for both ways. And that it's that a big part of samurai culture was that of these swordsmen who their life was dedicated toward, let's say if they had a master, if they were an actual samurai and they had a master, that they at any moment in time could be called to battle, or they may be challenged to a duel by someone who's a wandering hobo swordsman like Musashi, or even Musashi himself. Like Musashi was a painter and calligrapher and artist and poet and writer, as well as being 62-0 in fights to the death with a sword.
How so has that divide between brains and brawn come about?
I'm not sure exactly what you could say the roots are. Well, for me, I could hypothesize, but like you mentioned ancient Greece or the Stoics, and part of like Socrates had said something along the lines of that men should not study philosophy until they're 30, and until then they should wrestle. So he's like that, because there's an element of, and this is so like being of the mind and the body was, as you said, we can't really draw the line between the two, because there isn't a place where we can say either of them starts or stops.
Yeah.
And if someone's body is not, they don't need to be, if someone isn't healthy in the body, in terms of they have a body that just does what that functions. It's hard to even define health, but if someone is living such that their mental capacities are being limited, let's say if someone is only interested in certain intellectual pursuits, even if there wasn't things that they could learn about themselves and their own mind with physicality, there's still a reality that if their body, if the functioning of their meat vehicle is hindering their ability to concentrate for longer periods of time, because they're just not, they don't have an aerobic base, their back gets kind of sore from sitting down because they're kind of weak, and there's still a limitation there. But then there's a limitation to expressing their intellectual capacity that's provided by the fact that they live in a respirating and defecating meat suit. And in that sense, but then you add the fact that there's the possibility for them to even be able to learn more about themselves in such a way that they can learn about their own mind and the workings of their own emotions, their motivations, that can then help any of the other intellectual pursuits. So for example, if someone was to go and do 100 burpees in a field by themselves with no one around as quickly as possible, 100 chest to floor, hand release burpees in a field by themselves as quickly as possible, they're very quickly going to be in immense physical discomfort. Especially if they're not very well conditioned, or if they're not, well, anyone would be. Even you could take a world-class CrossFitter and go do 100 burpees as quickly as possible. Even when they train it as part of their sport, they're going to be in pain. But you could just pick any physical pursuit that immediately confronts someone with intense discomfort, the kind of discomfort where an internal dialogue is had, especially if you're by yourself and there's no social pressure and it's just discomfort for its own sake. And there's always the option to stop. There's always the option to quit. There's always the option to slow down. This physical discomfort is, reality doesn't really get much more real than that in terms of it's inescapable. There's this sensory information that it's unavoidable to navigate. And now I'm confronted with this information. And what that can do is the stress test that can put on let's say the stress test that kind of thing, just discomfort for its own sake, or even just physical discomfort in general, especially the holy grail is in there. When I'm in those places where the option is there to quit and the internal dialogue is taking place, where I'm essentially forced to find my why and forced to find my reasons for continuing, in spite of the fact that every cell in my body seems to want to stop or slow down. That forced confrontation with reality is the holy grail is in there. What is the why that justifies continuation in spite of suffering? So that's realistically, that's the question at the fund, what it means to be a human being at large, independent of why do I keep going with these burpees? But that's the question at the bottom of what it means to be a god with an anus. That's what a human is like.
That ties in as well with Ross Edgley. So, and it also ties in with the fact that now people have to do home workouts and how difficult it is to keep up home workouts because of that factor. When there's no one else around and it's just you, the option to quit, it's whatever, I'll do it tomorrow. And it's done before you even give thought to what is this doing to my psychological state that allows me to quit this early, and why did I even start doing these burpees if I was going to quit halfway through? And most people, and hold my hand up, 100% home workouts, I struggle with them. I've done 3-4 maybe workouts. I'm after getting into them kind of a little bit recently because I was trying to get up my core strength, and then I have the pull-up bars and etc. But Ross Edgley, and I highly recommend his book for anyone who hasn't read or even used it on Audible. Insane book. So Ross Edgley, if you don't know him, first man ever to swim all around the outside of Great Britain. Didn't touch land for five months. For about 150 something days, 154, 57 days. And so he'd be swimming in the sea on his own for up to 12 hours a day with nothing but this sensory deprivation, especially at night. You can't see anything beneath you. You can't hear anything over the wind and the waves. For hours and hours at a time, he'd be just swimming with just him and his thoughts with nothing to distract him.
Mm.
And how he pushed through is, his story is incredible. It is very, very, very powerful. And like, even just listening to the audiobook would make you want to go out and train. It has that ability to flick that emotional switch inside you that goes, I need to do something too. I need to feel that sort of activity. And I've rarely
Have that
come across.
engagement, because that internal dialogue is when you're forced. That's what's so, like, I've never done anything endurance wise, anything approximating that, of course, but that experience of that navigating to find that why, and that was this is like same reasons underneath the fighting, like with regards to participating in and then eventually stopping it, and those finding that why and why do it. Like, if someone, let's say, who's doing home workouts, like, what's their reason for working out? Like, this is kind of getting delving into, like, I suppose it's philosophy, really. It's
It
like,
is because you
psychology.
see, you would be
Why
asking the
do it?
question. This is where, like, if your motivations are shallow, this is where it won't stand to you. If your motivation is only to look good, the odds of you finishing out that workout drop significantly, because you can't think that far ahead. You can't think 6 months down the line when you actually have that six pack, because you, I don't know, got your diet under control as well. And so go on what you were saying there, but this is the point there where you need your why has to be a profound and a powerful one.
Yeah, it's like, because what is the, like, let's say, as I've definitely, like you mentioned the ego earlier on, and there's definitely, and I mentioned, like, let's say the body composition stuff or just the physical stuff, like, there's all these superficial reasons for participating. They're not necessarily bad. Like, as I said, people like to look good naked.
Yeah,
that's a reality, and that's not something that we can deny as humans, because our species wouldn't exist if it wasn't for sexual procreation. And a large assistance towards sexual procreation is sexual attraction. And a large contributor to sexual attraction is someone's physique.
yeah.
And there's a reality to the fact that we can't deny that aspect of our animality. That said, purely viewing participation in physical exercise or monitoring nutrition from a physical image aesthetic perspective, there's a shallowness to that that's missing out. I think, for me, if I just speak from my own experience, the shallowness to that's missing out on larger picture around the human condition, where, like, there's part of training for me that's not, it's like underneath all the rest of the stuff. So it's like, it's almost where training allows me to, because of all the things that occur from it, the internal dialogue, the confrontation with the why, the discipline needed to go out and do it, especially because I train outdoors nearly all the time in whatever the weather, like, it could be snowing, it doesn't matter, really cold, it's irrelevant. It's just like, there's a session to do, I'm going to go out and do it. And that kind of mentality doesn't necessarily, it's not about the end in itself is the gym. It's that all those internal dialogues, and it was the same with fighting, all those, as well as the physical capacities that are developed, the psychological skills, and that, and the contentment that can come from just having overcome resistance.
Yeah.
And how that can lead to this calmer mind, this increased self-confidence. Because I think the overcoming resistance is something that the more we do it, the better we get at doing it. And then that's a muscle in itself, almost like it's a mental muscle. And that is like a meta principle that carries across out to the rest of the life. But then why even do all that even? So, like, why is it even, so, like, Stoicism, for example, no,
continue.
But in Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius, in his book Meditations, he'd write something like, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Where he's basically saying that resistance is just opportunity, that the obstacles we encounter are just opportunities at getting better at dealing with future obstacles. But then, to me, underneath that again is like, well, why even do that? Why even make myself better at dealing with future obstacles? And eventually I reached a point number of years ago where and this was a kind of a mental switch, and this is along the lines of why I stopped fighting, is that it was this realization that as an individual, I myself was utterly irrelevant. But what was of the utmost importance was the ripple effect of the actions that I made in the world. Where I became, whereas that realization of what's of the utmost importance is the ripple effect that I leave as a result of my actions. Because there will come a time there will come a time with me where there will be no more time. Like the Stoics like Marcus Aurelius that would write like, soon you will be ashes or bones.
And forgotten about. Your name won't even be remembered.
Yeah, precisely. And Miyamoto Musashi would say, like, generally speaking, the way of the warrior is the resolute acceptance of death. Or he'd say, like, to win any duel, a man must fight as if he is already dead. And these kind of things, like, these are this realization, this switch of thinking about participation in training. For me, I can only, if I speak from my own experience, the participation in fighting, physical training now, or even any other aspect I have that are part of my life, my work, everything. It's not about me. It's about how I can be of use. That's the strongest possible, deepest anchor that I've been able to get to with regards to the quality of my work, the quality of my training, everything. It's just like underneath that, the why is, it's not about me, it's about how useful I am to other people.
And you see, then in terms of that is how it also spills over into your relationships with your girlfriend, with your friends, with your families, whereby if you're home, and when I say home, when your head is in order and your body and your mind are working in unison, you become more available and more productive for those around you, and you can help people more. And so if you can, it's almost like an alternative to ego lifting. If you can now imagine that you're not just lifting to look good, you're actually lifting to be good, and you're training to be better, and it starts setting your mind up for these completions of tasks and goals set for you, be it just your workout. And you said there that feeling you get, that real gratifying sensation. Like, one of the beauties of training and exercise is that a portion of that is immediate. The days that you really don't want to train, if you get yourself into that gym, when you leave that gym, before you even finish your sessions, you'll be glowing. You can feel it. You're going, the days that you most want to not train are the most important days to train, because they will be some of the best feelings you will get, because you're going from one end of the spectrum to the other. And so there's an immediate rush of endorphins, and there's an immediate rush of dopamine, and there's an immediate satisfaction with your training. And so if you have that feeling 4 times a week, even 2 times a week, and you have that every week for 6 weeks, all of a sudden you're looking back on your progress, and you even that feeling is more sustainable. And now you've got an entire block of time that you can extrapolate that emotion from, and that you see that your goal is being completed. And if you can then make that a lifestyle choice, you can't even calculate and predict how it's going to benefit you down the road. But I was curious, have you ever done PTing?
Yeah.
And do you still you're still actively PTing and taking on clients?
At the moment, no, obviously with the Wu flu, like, I'm not doing but maybe I will once things open up again.
Totally understand.
Still doing online stuff, but at the moment with in person, obviously not.
And so you can obviously recognize bad mental practices in clients that come to you, where you know the motivations behind what they're thinking. They say it. Maybe they come out and say, "Oh, well, look, I'm going on a summer holiday with my mates. I have to be in the best shape." And you're like, all right, fair enough. Yeah, grand. If that's your motivation and you understand what that means, all right. But do you ever try and contest the psychological state behind some of your clients?
That's a massive question, because there's first of all, there's a kind of almost just like I said earlier on, it's a very good question, because there isn't a line between mind and body. And the time spent with a client or any of my players, there are opportunities to talk and to learn about each other, and for me to learn about them and everything, and what someone's motivations might be. But in terms of contesting, it's really hard, because there's a, you know, a way for, how I can put this actually, that's maybe more practical, right? Is it's not necessarily contesting, but by creating scenarios where someone needs themselves to confront their why, then they'll find, just by exposure, they'll uncover the reasons for doing what they're doing. So for example, I might have players that are doing a very difficult kind of huffing and puffing conditioning drill.
Mm-hmm.
And towards the back half or third of like what could be a 3, 4, 5 minute long drill, I know that they're hurting physically. They have all these voices in their head. I know they're going through these dialogues, these internal dialogues. I know that they're going to be having these discussions around how hard they're able to keep going. Can I keep this pace up? And then, but to me, then that's where I'll often ask them. I'll be shouting out. I'll be on the middle of the rugby pitch and shouting to them, or the hurling pitch, and shouting, asking them, "What's your why? Why are you here? Why is this important? What is it about being here that makes this worthwhile? What's your why? What's your anchor? What find it, because that's your anchor to keep the ship steady."
And in those moments, you're actually getting down into the psychological trenches with them.
Yeah, well, more so, maybe I'm almost maybe not. I don't think I'm necessarily in there with them, because I'm not going through the same discomfort. But maybe what that kind of question is doing is it's holding up a kind of a beacon in the dark. Yeah. And it's kind of saying, well, look, if you can make your way toward, if you can try and find because the thing that allows someone to deal with the most amount of discomfort, that's what's beautiful about physical training in terms of very difficult like stuff that involves a lot of physical discomfort. And even, it doesn't even need to be something like there are versions of yoga that are so hard, you know, it doesn't even have to, it can be hard running or whatever, but something that's particularly uncomfortable. There's something so unforgiving and real about that experience, that because you're literally embodied, and there's this sensory information that you can't get away from. That's a perfect opportunity to explore what is the reason or the why that will allow me to most easily navigate this inescapable discomfort. Because the why that will allow me to most easily navigate this discomfort is what my deepest why that I can get to is at the moment. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of thing I'll do, because humans are so complex, and we're so, like, what really motivates us is along the lines of like it's not one single thing. It's like a mixed motivational soup is the way I think of it. And but to me, from my personal experience, the why that's facilitated, because it's rewarding in itself. It's like the why that's facilitated the most amount of to navigate the most discomfort most easily is when there's this awareness of the ripple effect that my own actions can have. And then that in itself, there's a kind of a nice feeling to that, the same way that at Christmas time it feels better to give presents than to get them.
Yes. Yeah.
And that it's for that same reason. It's like it's the same thing. It's just this underlying evolutionarily useful altruism. Yeah, altruistic. And it's that it's and I call it I call it, because it's somewhere between, and the motivational feeling that comes with that, I call it altruinsic, because
Ooh, nice. Because you've intrinsic and extrinsic
yeah,
motivations, and so
and it's
you've combined the
between the
two.
two really, because it's not because extrinsic is about achieving some kind of external reward or external recognition, or it's about achieving something in the outside world. And intrinsic is when something is rewarding for its own sake.
Yes.
But altruinsic is what I refer to it, because I couldn't think of a better way of putting it, because it's not based on external reward or external feedback. It's based on, and it's not, altruism isn't, because we don't know if it's going to have a good effect. And it's not based on being rewarding for its own sake, because then it might not need to have an engagement with the outside world. But altruinsic motivation is like a perceived ability to influence the outside world in a positive way.
That's
So then,
that's very good. I like what you've done there, because a lot of people need to understand as well about the significance of extrinsic and intrinsic motivations, because they're actually crucial to your development as a human, and to your completion of goals and targets you set for yourself. And like, just briefly now, I'm not an expert in any of this, but I've read into it a good bit. And so, as you said, extrinsic is motivations from the outside. And intrinsic, as you said, for the value of the activity itself. Intrinsic is usually argued to be the more powerful motivation. And now, you'll have to give me a hand to come up with a good example of the difference between the two.
extrinsic would be something along the lines of winning, let's say, winning a competition, or getting like, I'll be happy when I achieve X. And intrinsic would be kind of just enjoying what you're doing.
Yes.
Kind of almost regardless of what the external factors are. It's like just kind of a intrinsic reward would be like dependent on some kind of outside factor to occur, or outside event to occur. And intrinsic would be like just a contentment or a happiness with partaking in a process itself. And altruinsic is almost, that's why it's kind of between the two, because it's not about achieving a definite outcome in the outside world, and it's not about just being rewarding for its own sake. It's rewarding for its own sake because altruinsic motivation to me is, it's rewarding for its own sake because of the perceived ability to influence the outside world in a positive way. So it's that's why I had to kind of give it this term, because there wasn't anything else. Neither of those two kind of captured it.
That's good. You know? No, I like that. Altruinsic, is it? No.
Altruinsic. Yeah.
Altruinsic. Very good. You said as well, you mentioned teams. Are you currently coaching teams, or is it you strength and conditioning, or what's the story there?
Yeah, coach rugby teams. And
who are you coaching?
Sorry?
Who are you coaching at the minute?
Cork rugby. And I work with one of the schools teams here in Cork as well. So it's like I really like working in rugby, and I coached in hurling for years as well, and did bits and pieces in gas. So I enjoy the teams, especially. But I've kind of chosen kind of a path for myself professionally, where I haven't applied for any pro jobs. Like I worked in pro rugby years ago for a stint. Like I interned at Munster when I was in college, and then I worked in Connacht for a while in 2015, Connacht rugby. But since then, I spent most of 2016, 15 and 16 living in America. I was over there just training and fighting, training for fighting. And then 2017 moved back here, moved to Ireland, and then moved to Cork again after living here before. And since then, I've kind of decided to just stay here. So it's necessitated just building a career out of working with amateur athletes in terms of teams.
That's quite tough, because I've got few friends, obviously, who are PTs, and I've got one close friend of mine now doing sports science in Tipperary, and one of the things is finding sources of income when you're qualified is quite difficult. like the majority of jobs are either unpaid or they're low paid, which is disappointing because the market hasn't appreciated the value that's in it yet. And I imagine it probably will as things get tidied up, and as I think eventually they're going to have to filter out all these half qualified PTs, because it's too dangerous. You've got people who don't know what they're doing telling other people how to lift and how to do very like physically dangerous exercises and movements. Like when you talk about squatting, just because it's common practice to hear the word squatting doesn't mean any old fella knows how to actually sit down and stand back up. You're putting a huge amount of weight on your spine, and you're dropping towards gravity and expecting yourself to lift it. And if you aren't adequately trained, you're going to really hurt yourself and potentially other people. And so they're doing it at the minute with counselors and with people who claim to be psychologists, or actually not psychologists, people who claim to be counselors, is they're creating a narrow road whereby you have to have these particular accreditations before you're allowed to counsel people, because there's the acknowledgement that there's a lot of not pseudo-based courses, but there's a lot of poor quality ones, and it's easy to get online certification with very little training or one-on-one contact. And you're going into people's minds and you're meddling with very, 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 very delicate and very important facets of their personalities. And it's the same with physical training. You're going and you're potentially altering how someone's going to move for the rest of their life, especially if you give them a serious injury or if they just begin to move incorrectly to begin with. So they're going to filter out, I think, a lot of the crappy PTs. And I hope then the market becomes more streamlined and more financially rewarding for those who are committed to actually providing a high quality service. But going forward in the future, like how have you plans at the minute once COVID lifts? Have you any goals or any schemes that you've been waiting to unleash?
Training in terms of sport and training, like I started a professional doctorate last year, PhD with a British university, and I'll probably be able to pick that back up because I need sport for that to be working, to do the research and everything. So,
and what's that doctorate in?
Elite performance. Specifically, it's focused around sports psychology.
Okay.
And performance psychology. But around sport, I'm looking forward to just being back working with athletes and on the pitch and going to games, and I just really enjoy the process. Like I very, very, very much enjoy my job. But in terms of what I'm doing, what I've been working on and doing is I've been in a very much unrelated field. I've been writing a book, and I started it 2 years ago. And then it became something entirely different. In April or May, I realized it was actually turning, and then it turned into something else. And now it looks like it's in the kind of closing stages where I've got pretty much got the ideas nearly on paper, like in terms and I have an outline. So I'm nearly at the point now where I can actually just put it together and edit it. Mm-hmm. And but what I'm going to do, I'm not sure. It's based around the idea of like these two major questions that are facing individuals in the secular West are largely, and humans in general, but particularly in the secular West, in the absence of the Judeo-Christian ethic that was there, that kind of gave birth to the Western civilization, is along the lines of in the what Nietzsche would have called the God-shaped hole in West, or Nietzsche would have said God is dead in the late 1800s. And then I've heard it put like a God-shaped hole in Western civilization, or a religion-shaped hole.
Yeah.
What is it that gives, let's say, what is it that provides meaning to existence in the absence of an overarching cosmic metaphysic like that the Judeo-Christianity would have served as? Mm-hmm. And this is obviously the biggest question imaginable, and there's definitely an element of there's an element of kind of catching myself as like, what the fuck am I doing, wrestling with the biggest questions, but at the same time, but then I'm like, well, I'm a human the same as anyone else, and I have to navigate these same issues. So then I'm writing it from first person. It's like, how do I navigate the God-shaped hole, what has been referred to as the meaning crisis. And like, what is it that justifies the suffering in life? Like, what is it that justifies the suffering that will almost certainly be encountered as our loved ones die, if they die before us, or the difficulties that we encounter in life? Hardship, disease, even if we don't end up getting some kind of fatal disease, there'll still be inevitable decay that occurs, and eventually I'll be, like Marcus Aurelius said, ashes or bones. And that's going to, so what is it that justifies the difficulties and the suffering between now and then? And then the second component is, as a species, in 1945 we entered there's a guy from Oxford called Toby Ord, who works at the Oxford University and the Future of Humanity Institute, refers to it as the precipice, which is, upon the development of the bomb in 1945, we entered an era where we now have the ability to essentially end, if not all life on Earth, then at least the human race and lots of other megafauna. Because with the development of nuclear weapons, and then the harnessing of more and more means of wiping ourselves out, and we've entered in it because of, let's say, something like the biggest threats to humanity are largely anthropogenic ones. They're they're human. So essentially, nuclear holocaust, like where the nuclear bombs going off is one problem, but then it's the nuclear winter that's caused as a result of a particulate matter going up into the air and reflecting back out sunlight and causing a global cooling that would essentially potentially just eradicate nearly all biological life if enough of it occurred, because sunlight can't get in. And not all biological life, but complex, large forms and large mammals, etc. Or things like misaligned artificial intelligence, or obviously ones of climate change, biodiversity loss, or something like engineered pandemics, these kind of things. But to me, there's a relationship between those two problems. So there's the problem that an individual humans has to navigate as they're trying to figure out how to live in the face of their own inevitable demise. And then there's the question that our species faces, which, how do we live given that the same technology that gave us the ability to have 7.8 billion people alive when there was only 1 billion people. It took 300,000 years to get to 1 billion people just after 1800. And then it took about 200 years to get from 1 billion to 7.8 because of advances in food production,
medicine,
science and technology to allow incubators, cure diseases, incubators for babies, infant mortality rates are down, etc. All these things. Violence has never been lower, but at the same time, we've never been more well equipped to end all human life. Or if not end all human life, then collapse civilization into some kind of a Mad Max world, or end up in some kind of bizarre cabal of techno dictatorships or something like is going on in China.
Yeah.
Or at least coming in, looks like it's occurring in China, where everything's being monitored, and that technology is only going to increase that. So all those kind of issues are of seem to be, to me, the most pressing thing and the most interesting thing to research and write about, because we don't get to figure out how to live. We don't get to figure out how to find meaning in existence. We don't get a chance to experience different whys underneath our participation in difficult things, or we don't get the chance to read Stoicism or learn from the Zen Buddhist samurai if we're all dead, or if we're worried about avoiding Mad Max cannibal raider people or whatever, because they're worried about trying to get your next meal because civilization is collapsing, society's falling apart or whatever. To me, the questions don't get more interesting or meaningful than those.
And the interesting thing as well is, because you sent me on, and I'm going to recommend people to listen to this. You sent me on, you have 2 podcasts of your own, is it?
Yeah.
You have 2 podcasts, and one is Quarrelsome's.
Yeah, Quarrelsome Life Radio is podcast that's on like podcast apps like Spotify, and then there's another one that I do with a lad over in England called James. His name is James Velitis, and we do one called the Axiom of the Infinite Unknown that's on YouTube. So that's
what's the concept behind that one?
It's basically me and James either pick a topic in advance, or don't pick a topic in advance and just hit record. But usually we've picked a topic, we decide what we're going to talk about, and then we just kind of we do some research beforehand, figure out ways of approaching it, kicking us off, and then talk about usually geopolitics, existential risks, civilization and collapse, things around what China's getting up to, that kind of big geopolitical questions, or philosophy, psychology, economics. Just kind of, it's an excuse for us to have Zoom calls like this every few weeks and just kind of shoot the shit and talk about big questions. And
to be fair, you sent me on your essay, The Divine Joker, where you took Todd Phillips' The Joker, released in 2019, and you broke it down and incorporated over the space of 2 hours some incredibly complex human issues, from racism to inequality to all these different dilemmas. And what you did, what amazed me, was how balanced you were in going through the research and how well you explained each topic before you went into it. And then at the very end, you brought it back and you had 7 main points of contention, and you put yourself in the mind frame of each of those and how they affected you. So you weren't standing up on a precipice and wagging your finger at all these unintellectual people or what have you. You got into it very much. It was very much an introspective journey that you happened to put on paper, and it was incredibly well written. And I was hoping to get around to it today, but I think when we started off on their sports related conversation, it was a conversation I wanted to have, and I haven't had a fully qualified sports scientist on so far, and so I wanted to pick your mind about a lot of stuff there, so I let it run. I'm conscious of time, so I'll let you flag me when you need to go, and that's fine. But the Divine Joker, and I'll share it on the Instagram, very, very good. And so I'm actually quite excited to see what you put together in book format, because you articulate yourself very well, and you get the emphasis as the listener that you've gone over each sentence a couple of numerous times to really flesh out, is this what I mean? And how does this summarize what I'm talking about in the best format? Because it has that effect. Whereas the listener, you have those multiple light bulb moments and you're like, I understand what he's talking about. I understand that. And I've actually thought about that. And that's an incredibly good skill. So you're obviously a gifted writer in that regard. And I actually went away and I rewatched The Joker last night, because I'd only seen it the once in the cinema. And I said, when you broke it down and you even drew the similarities between Todd Phillips choosing the name Arthur Fleck and tying it back to King Arthur, I was like, I've missed too much here. How did I miss this?
It's the hero journey. Shadow side of the hero journey. It's beautiful. One of the best things. It's one of the best movies I've ever seen. It's unbelievable.
I couldn't believe how I'd missed as much that you had picked up on how it's the shadow, as Solzhenitsyn said, the line between good and evil goes through the heart. All superhero movies, usually the evil is out here as the villain and the hero is over here. And there's that disconnect where you say, well, there's good and there's evil and they're separate entities, and good will eventually triumph over evil. I never copped that in The Joker, Todd Phillips manages to intertwine the two of them and shows that sometimes the evil is the one that wins. And you can put yourself into the mind frame of the Joker as he baby steps you along and says, look, this is an emotion. You can totally comprehend this. You've seen situations like this in your own life. And particularly that scene where he shoots the 3 stockbrokers on the train who are annoying the woman. There's that visceral, in your mind's eye, I would have done the same. Here we have 3 bullies picking on vulnerable people. They deserve to be shot. And there's that very gratifying, I wish I could have done that to people who picked on me or people I watched picking on other people. And so there's a very good line, and I recorded it, where you said, 2 seconds now, I've saved here. It is not merely the ability within each of us to commit heinous acts of violence and hateful actions of destruction that elicits the most terror. It is the fact that we may take pleasure in conducting them, in carrying them out.
Yeah.
That stuck with me because it's something that people don't want to get on board with. Is this concept that this evil out over there that we condemn is actually the evil that is within us and the potential for evil that is in all of us.
Yeah. And the more visceral the emotional reaction we have to it, in terms of anger, to some act, in terms of anger, in terms of a sense of superiority or a sense of I'm better than them, the more visceral that is, the less we've embodied our own recognition of the potential within us. Like the way that this is kind of like Jungian psychology based around a concept called shadow projection, which is a major component of that book, like, or that essay. And just thank you first of all, thanks very much for the kind words on the essay itself.
It's a pleasure, man. It was an absolute delight to listen to, and I was truly caught on the hop of how good it was.
Oh, I appreciate it, man. And the book that I'm writing is essentially key ideas in that essay expanded out to 70,000 words, 80,000 words. It's those main ideas around the meaning crisis, and how an existential risk, the collapse of civilization, conflict amongst people, and how shadow projection plays a role in that, death, anxiety, and how humans navigate it. These big questions, and the book is based, and scientific thinking, epistemic humility as it relates to just being humble in the face of infinite ignorance that we all face. And these big questions that I see as, for me, as someone in the 21st century trying to navigate the complexity of existence, they're, to me, the questions that have just gripped me the most, and the topics that have gripped me the most, in terms of figuring out how do I live in the world in the face of my own death, and in the face of potential civilizational collapse and human extinction. That isn't, like, it sounds so dramatic to say, but an obvious example would be something like the stuff that just went on in America last year and kind of culminated in that dramatic event at the Capitol building, where there's, especially when we live in a functioning society that's functioning to the extent that there's societal stability and there's a functioning government, and there's a monopoly on violence held by the government, that we give the government a monopoly on violence over us so that they can maintain law and order, and we don't have to have using rule of law and an imposition using like something like obviously as a police force or a military as a way of physically imposing the rule of law if they need to, that's so that we don't have to have gangs or bands of like a warlord with his own little army and such, so we can mind our stuff, you know, like there's a real ability to it, but there's a fragile film or a fragile layer above civilization that is civilization, that's above these elements of human nature, and shadow projection is a component of this, where there's shadow projection, in short, is that the parts of ourselves that we most, so that the things about other people that we most despise are the components of our own psyche that we most fear.
So this is a big one, and I was only thinking about it this morning because Luke McGrain, who we actually happen to know, was the first person to really flag this one for me, where he says, be mindful of the traits in other people that annoy you the most, because it's more than likely the characteristics that you are actually recognizing of you in somebody else.
Yeah.
And you have to really give that a bit of thought. So when he said it, I sat up and I was actually automatically embarrassed, because I realized this is precisely it. The things that annoy me most in others is exactly the characteristics that I can see in my own personality,
but want to avoid, but haven't accepted or
but
part. Like,
never felt the same repulsion that I feel when I see somebody else doing it.
yeah,
This was interesting, was that it wasn't a problem when I did it. For me, it was part of a comic effect, or it was I don't know, being silly or being whatever. But when somebody else does it, it's irritating. It's, why are you behaving like that? Would you be mature, be whatever? And it really caught me, because it was a self-righteousness that I had been oblivious to.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's the power of it, though, is that, think about how that works in terms of conflict resolution. That, as I've been there, like, so an example would be, so that essay, a lot of the stuff I talked about would have been based around like the shadow projections that I wrote about in that essay, the shadow projections that I had around a lot of what could be called loads of different names, like hyper political correctness, far left political correctness, woke, social justice with a capital S and a capital J, all these different names. They're all, it's that area of essentially like things like cancel culture, or people who try and shut down or rant about someone like Jordan Peterson being a Nazi, or this kind of rhetoric. The projections that I was having at seeing in a really visceral way. There's a video I put up on YouTube around the George Floyd protests just after they began back in June. And it's called "The West Did Not Invent Racism." And it's like I don't know what it is. It could be 10 minutes long of me ranting into my phone on a walk, because all I was seeing was all over social media and the newspapers and YouTube. It's just that all, and the protests themselves was this self-flagellation of Western civilization, and this kind of blame swinging, and this idea that the West was the worst place on earth, that we're just like this horrible place, and that because of things like colonialism or the fact that racists have of course existed, that there's this kind of conflation with that, and as if to say that this is the worst place ever and the most racist place ever. And this kind of essence was coming from the woke, or what I saw as the woke. And by the woke, I mean not even just people who are familiar with the ideology that underpins this kind of critical theory, postmodern flavor of Marxist, a transition from like a Marxist class consciousness to a kind of almost like a critical consciousness that's based around critiquing differentiations between power groups as if it's the fundamental way of viewing human relations, etc. These kind of things. It was actually people just adopting rhetoric and being led along by a Pied Piper. And this you can see in that video, I was so wound up when I was saying it. And that was me, like that, the fact that I was getting so wound up was me projecting shadow. It was me projecting where there was traits, and writing that essay on the Joker allowed me to explore what it was that was causing me to get so wound up in response to the woke. And it was acknowledging these, what I saw as motivations in them, that by writing about it and reading out loud what I wrote allowed me to make sense of them within myself, such that now I still am ardently opposed to a worldview that's based on ignoring the unique individual and focusing on group characteristics and power differentials between groups as if it's the primary way of viewing reality. That's what these kind of far left or hyper political correctness or woke or whatever, that's what they do. They view the world in this religious lens based on power differentials between groups, as if, and then that basically puts the heterosexual white male as the most evil person in society. I still ardently opposed to that way of viewing, because I just see it as inherently destructive. But my emotive responses to hearing these arguments, or to seeing people put them forward, or to see people even scream and shout themselves and present these what I see to be fallacious views of the human condition and how society actually functions, there's a calmness there now, because there's a feeling of being aware of my own parts of myself that I had not made conscious.
I would
Parts
describe
that
it.
I had not brought into consciousness.
I would describe it as you've essentially put yourself into the intellectual furnace and burned off a lot of the impurities that left you feeling that sort of emotion at the beginning, and now you have that sort of that calmness, that stillness. And on a side note, I think that's one of the big advantages around journaling, is that it forces you to actually write down, okay, what am I thinking and why am I thinking this? And when you see it in front of you, or when you verbalize it, because that's one of the things I do, I speak to myself a lot. I have a lot of conversations when I'm on my own, and sometimes I'll say something and go, oh my goodness, I hope no one heard that. And you realize then some of your thoughts that you've allowed to fester in the back of your mind, and even you see them in your back of the mind, and when it comes out, you realize the flaw in it. And so that's one of the big advantages to your writing, is that you've first of all played it, well, you've primarily played it through your own lens, and you haven't written this as this projection of this is how everyone should live. It's this, here is what I've wrestled with psychologically, coming back to Stoicism and wrestling, intellectually and physically wrestling, is this concept of challenging yourself and not assuming that you have it right. And in doing so, you actually avoid a lot of the pitfalls you see in both people on the left and the right condemning each other. And there's people in the middle going, you're both wrong. Like, can you not see this? Like, your views here are wrong and your views there are wrong. And as long as you're still shouting at each other, you're never going to fix any of them. And I want to bring it back as well for a minute to what you were saying about this, about the potential end of civilization, because there's so many movies are based off it. Like, this pop culture has exhausted this concept of an apocalyptic existence, and so when people hear it said, they may automatically disregard it. But it's been festering beneath the surface, and we particularly saw it then in America when they stormed Congress. Like, hang on, what? They stormed their own government buildings. This is insane. This is stuff you expect to see in Palestine and play the war-torn countries. And only this morning, Yahoo Finance. This, and I saved this because I said this is actually, the coincidence of this coming out is too great. So, and this is Yahoo Finance. Yahoo Finance. Putin warns world risks of a fight of all against all in a grim dysphoria. So he was speaking, Putin, right? This is Putin, Russia's Putin. We're speaking at the World Economic Forum. And he said, let me get his quote. There are parallels between the current era and the 1920s and 30s, a period that led to the catastrophic World War II. Nowadays, such a heated conflict is not possible, I hope, because it will mean the end of all civilization. Now, he's referring to the concept of mutual destruction that came about after nuclear weapons were discovered and created. All of a sudden, what happened was you was a guaranteed mutual destruction. If you launched a nuclear weapon at somebody else, they're launching one back. And no matter who, there's no winner in this. There's absolutely no winner. If you start a nuclear war, it's game over. It's someone's pressed the reset button. It's rebooted your phone. All your information's gone. There's no coming back from that point. But Putin goes on and says, there is a possibility that we may experience an actual collapse in global development that may result in a fight against all. He said the risk of return to war has developed over many years due to issues such as inequality, growing political radicalization, and growing international tensions. And the problem is, so he said, international institutions are weakening, regional conflicts are multiplying, and global security systems are degrading. And you know something? He's right. On 100%. All accounts, he's right.
That's some of the most poignant... They're some of the most poignant words I've heard from any political leader in years.
Yes, because he's speaking truth there.
Yeah, like that's the harshality. Like speaking of Russia, two people that very few of us in the West know about, but need to, I think, are Vasily Arkhipov and Stanislav Petrov. Two of those men are Russians whose decisions as individuals meant that we're actually still alive.
I know that Petrov fella, there was, and if sorry to ruin your story, well,
Oh,
no,
no,
you
no,
go.
no, I love this because
Is
like
this
this.
is this the fella who didn't respond with nuclear strikes because he was unsure if something they were seeing was an attack or not, and he disobeyed direct orders?
Yeah, he disobeyed the protocol. Basically,
Yes.
with Petrov, I'm delighted you know about it, man, because people need to know about how close these near misses were, and there
Yeah.
was fucking loads of them. But
Yeah.
these are two maybe that the Westerners don't know about because they're Russians, and because of they happened during the Cold War. There was maybe an allergy in the West toward highlighting heroism by the Soviet Union or
Hmm.
members of the Soviet Union. And then even within the Soviet Union, they didn't really get much. These two lads didn't get much recognition either.
No.
So Petrov basically was involved in a decision where he disobeyed protocol and refused to push the button to launch a counterstrike because there was on the radar that showed 5 missiles coming in from the West. And he just made a cool, calm decision under pressure. Like everyone else was freaking out. His protocol was when the missiles are coming in and the radar shows the missiles, you have to strike back. And he just made this decision. He was like, you know what? In calm, cool, stoic as fuck. He just was like, you know what? If the West was going to take on Russia, they're not just going to fire 5 missiles at us.
Hmm.
They're going to fire a lot more than that because they had thousands of them.
Yes.
And he decided not to shoot. He decided not to do it. And it turned out to be a glitch in the radar,
Yeah.
basically. And then Vasily Arkhipov was along similar lines, but even more intense, where he was in a submarine, a submarine with a nuclear warhead inside it, off the coast of America. And there was an American warship dropping what were practice or training depth charges on top of down onto the submarine. But the warship just wanted to get them to surface. But they thought that they were under attack. And in there was like 110 degrees Fahrenheit inside the submarine, and they were running out of oxygen. So they're getting cooked, and people are passing out and fainting and everything. And the decision was made, like, we're under attack. Is this they couldn't keep the radio communication wasn't working, everything, the tech was down, and they were like, do we attack? Because we're at war now. And this could be it now. Like we have the opportunity to take out an American city now if we push the button. And Vasily Arkhipov was cool and calm enough in that kind of pressure cooker, literally, to decide, do you know what? The explosions are going off left, right, left, right, left, right, in what seems to be a coordinated manner. I don't think they're trying to take us out. I think they're trying to send us a signal. Maybe they want us to surface. And he was calm enough and cool enough, and they did that. Because if that nuclear weapon had gone off and there was a nuclear explosion, it was either a tactical nuclear weapon that they could use on one of those ships, or it was a intercontinental ballistic. I'm not sure exactly, but it was a nuclear weapon regardless. And if that could have, think about the phone call comes into the president or some generals who all of a sudden they hear a nuclear weapon has just attacked an American fleet or an American city. Like the fear that would kick off, and the likelihood that would kick off a domino effect, where it's just mutual, as you said, mutually assured destruction, is so high because the tensions are so high, especially in the Cold War period. So there's been loads of near misses, like the Capitol building and massive civil unrest in the world's figurehead democracy, stable democratic nation. That's one aspect, but even more pertinent than that is the fact that we're obviously recording this during a global pandemic, and the virus that's made its way around the world and obviously doing all these mutations is relatively benign relative to other viruses.
Yeah.
Like there's something like smallpox that I think is more infectious than the coronavirus, but kills 30% of people that it infects. Like that was also a possibility. And the way our institute, that was like, there's like things like this exist. There are bird flus that exist in biosafety level 4 labs that have 60-70% mortality rates that can take out 60 to 70% of people who get infected. Like these viruses exist. And so like, there's so many different ways. And like this, and you could look at the global pandemic with the reaction of governments the world over, with the exception of very few, was disastrous.
Panic.
absolutely disastrous, where there was, so this pandemic even isn't what is, so there's different classifications of risk based on that I use like different terminology. So there's a guy called Nassim Taleb wrote a book called The Black Swan, where a black swan is something that's unpredictable, it's of extreme impact, and but in retrospect it's explainable. There's another thing called a grey rhino that's a build on to this. Another lady, I think her name is Michelle Wooker, I think is her second name. She's a really good book. She wrote this book called The Grey Rhino, where a grey rhino is something that's predictable, but of extreme impact. And this pandemic that we're living through was a grey rhino.
Rhino, yeah.
Because like 2015, I wasn't as into existential risk. The reason that my book changed into this is because of the pandemic in which I find myself, and it reignited a little spark, or a little spark reignited some tinder that I didn't realize I was actually around this existential risk stuff. But basically, in retrospect, there was experts shouting from rooftops that weren't being listened to by government agencies about pandemic. Bill Gates gave a TED talk in 2015. Even Vox, that website, they did a documentary on that's on Netflix called Vox Explained, I think it's called.
Yeah,
and they
brilliant.
did a podcast about the virus potentially coming from China. Did this briefly mention? I watched so much, I can't remember if their one did, but basically highlighting the risk of China in particular as a source of these viruses because of the zoonotic life that they have and the wet markets, etc. And there was all these warnings that the way our government, so you mentioned the market earlier on, for example, there's the market is one thing, but then there's also the government institutions and the incentive structures. Is that the incentive structures for politicians and for companies themselves aren't set up to be able to orientate toward relatively low probability but high impact problems that occur only every 10 years or 100 years or whatever. Because the incentive structures for politicians are to do what gets them elected in 4 or 5 years, every 4 or 5 years. And the incentives for companies are to do what gets better quarterly reports and yearly reports. So it's like, it's not based around how do we orientate such that a pandemic that might only happen every 10, 20 years or longer, that we actually have infrastructure to take care of it. But and there's a lack of an awareness that there's billions that might be spent every year by governments that could prevent trillions being lost in the event of the pandemic, which is what's happened. So that because the experts in existential risk weren't listened to, and experts in virology weren't listened to, and epidemiologists weren't listened to for years and years and years, billions could have been spent to save the trillions that are being lost now. And that's not even to look at the human cost in terms of life, and in terms of direct loss of life, and in terms of direct loss of the mental health crisis that's going on around like things like suicide and addiction and substance and all these things that are also ripple effects of businesses being shut down, people's like you mentioned earlier on, coping mechanisms being taken away from people who would have used the gym or a certain sport or other activities as coping mechanisms to navigate their difficulties. So these the seeming, and then you just look at there's something even less abstract again, is what's happening all the time, which is biodiversity loss, like where the bees are dying and the butterflies are dying all over the world, because and if they die, we can't grow food. That's just one layer. Like if the bees die, we die. And so there's all these different things coinciding. And then the likes of the one last point, because you mentioned the capital, that might be of interest, is just there's this kind of idea around artificial intelligence that what we need to be worried about is Terminator, Rise of the Machines. Like machines going to come alive, artificial general intelligence, and realize that humans are in its way. And that's not what we necessarily need to be worried about. We need to be worried about AI that actually does what we want it to do. Like has happened with, like, for example, social media algorithms that are generating ideological echo chambers and increasing political polarization and extremism. Like the same essence that led to the manic, like one of the contributing factors to the manic reaction to George Floyd dying, is the same thing as a contributing factor to the Capitol Hill thing, which The artificial intelligence algorithms, the machine learning algorithms that learn better and better how to keep you addicted to the screen and how to keep you coming back to screen time, they've just, by nature of doing their job is, which is to generate screen time in order to be able to collect data, to be able to sell to advertisers, that in itself then facilitates this increasing polarization and echo chamber effect, where people their view of reality gets more and more different.
That's a very fascinating point, because it strays away from the traditional robots going to take over the world and that concept to the reality of robots taking over the world is actually a lot more straightforward. It's not that they decide humans must be eradicated. It's the fact that you have programs to do this linear, because this robots you see, this is the beauty of them. They are dead straight. They will do what you tell them. There's no bias here. There's no emotions involved. And we as humans cannot comprehend the potential for the actualization of what we ask. Like, think even on a simple thing with your relations with people. Like, if say a particular characteristic is annoying you and with a girlfriend or with something, and you say, look, it bugs me when you do this. Can you try not to? Okay, fine. Yep, no problem. And it's all healthy. It's all natural. And then they start doing what you've asked them. And the next thing you realize, it actually makes you more unhappy, or you missed what they were doing before, and you realize that what you requested was not what you were actually looking for. And so as humans, we're so dumb on a general basis. We do not foresee the consequences of our actions. And so you're actually looking at this whole concept of what would you call it? What sort of AI actualization maybe, is that the real consequences isn't that they'll go off and do some weird
that's a possibility as well, but that's
been destroyed though by science fiction movies and stuff, that whole concept of what happens if AI take over the world. You're actually looking at it from the point of view of what if AI does exactly what we ask of it. And that's a very interesting point.
What's happened, that's why. And it's what's happening, and I think it's driving, like, AI as it's currently working in big tech is driving, as a result, it's driving a mass psychosis.
That's scary, man. That's actually real scary. I hadn't considered it in the light that you have there.
It's driving a mass psychosis, and it's it's facilitating, because the trends in humanity, because of access to information, because of access to art and literature and movies and music from all over the world, the trend has been this increasing humanization, this increasing maybe recognition of shared humanity. As as we've gotten to travel more, tourism, immigration, emigration, access to movies from all over the world, etc. There's been this trend toward, and that's evidenced in things like, obviously, nuclear weapons have played a role in terms of preventing mass conflict, but also the fact that people and goods can cross borders meant that armies didn't need to. But then, and then there's this cooperation, but that trend is being affected negatively by, that trend of increasing recognition of shared humanity is being negatively affected now, particularly in the last decade or so, by these echo chambers generated by social media that fuels, essentially, it magnifies things like tribalism and shadow projection. Particularly, shadow projection is underneath it, but this kind of tribalism, things like our tribal tendencies, confirmation bias, something like negativity bias as well, where we're hardwired to pay attention to things that elicit negative emotional responses, because that's what would have facilitated survival in evolutionary sense, where remembering that if a bush shakes, if I'm out hunting with you and a bush shakes, and I think that it's our mate that was off hunting or that ran off after an animal earlier on, and you're like, man, I don't know if I like the idea of that sound. And then I go, fucking, I'll be grand. That's grok over there in the bush. I'm gonna have to check it out. And then I go over and get my face bitten off by a saber-tooth tiger. You're going to fucking remember that when the bush shakes, take a handy, like be conservative. And then you'll tell all your mates about it. Ciaran just got his head bitten off by a fucking tiger because he thought the bush was shaking or hunting. But then that embeds itself. Negative responses embed itself. So these things are being hijacked. Like our limbic system, our emotional systems are hijacked because that's by the AI that are running the algorithmic programs to hack. So we have this thing around hacking where humans hack computers and humans hack into systems and stuff. What we're not paying attention to is that the AI in social media is hacking us. So like we're being manipulated to optimize by these algorithms, to optimize for screen time, because then more data can be collected so that data can be sold to advertisers. And so like there's a brilliant documentary called The Social Dilemma. And a line in that documentary was that if you're not paying for the product, you are the product.
Yeah.
And that's a really potent way of distilling it down. And this ideology, so there have been like the 1920s and 30s, there wasn't obviously social media, and there was obviously, of course, there was massive tribalism, there was shadow projection taking place on a huge scale, these affiliations towards these grand narratives like fascism or communism, this fear in Western liberal democracies about fascism and communism, about communism, and then resultant reactions to that involve things like fascism. So like these ideological extremism and violence and tribal violence, of course, has existed for forever, basically, as long as it's been humans, maybe, or civilization. But the difference is, so like people might say, well, there was war in the past, and there was fascists in the past fighting Nazis, and there was violence in the streets, and there was all sorts of things happened. Or sorry, Nazis fighting communists in the street, and all these in Germany, let's say 1930s Weimar Republic Germany. That's true, and that's not wrong. But the difference is there's been an upward trend away from violence and toward recognition of shared humanity, and that violence. The violence has never been lower. Like international global conflicts don't really exist to the same extent. Like there was like proxy conflicts, for example, taking place between the United Arab Emirates and Turkey in Libya. And there's all these things, or there's like, or Azerbaijan and Armenia had a violent conflict last year. But for the most part, large scale global conflict between nation states is relatively, doesn't really occur anymore. And the scale, there's proxy wars play out, like things like Syria, but
that book Enlightenment Now, he summarizes all that society has never been safer.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the difference is now is that it's actually, so there's this movement toward, that's been taking place for years and years, toward peace, toward recognition of shared humanity, toward a decrease in xenophobia, a decrease in dehumanization of people from other cultures or religions, etc. And that trend is being pushed back against by these echo chambers generated by AI algorithms.
Now, I'm searching for the last few minutes. I'm looking for the World Economic Forum had a video up on their Instagram the other day, which looked at the end, what they projected is the necessary end of neoliberalism, because they were blaming the free markets, and not directly blaming them, but indirectly free markets have caused the extremities that we see in terms of inequalities. Like it was the 1800s or 1900s where the CEO of a company or the leader of a company made, was it 20 to 40 times the employees.
It was like the mid-level, the CEO made, this is in the 50s or 60s, the CEO made 20 times the salary of the mid-level employee, and now it's 400 times.
400 times, that was it, yeah. And so these disparities are coming bigger and bigger. Now, you'll have to bear with me 2 seconds, end of neoliberalism, because they had a very good video which looks at what we can do instead. And I was looking for it there. There's a beautiful, here we go, I have it. The world must move on from neoliberalism. So they had a term for what would come after. So I'm just going to allow that play through. I'm sorry now to be doing this. I really need a Jamie, someone who can do this while while I'm talking. So they're looking at, yes, so we have the markets that are set up at the minute, which devalues human rights and maximizes profits. So we've got profits over people as the emphasis. And there's this video now where they put together, and I'll share it again to my Instagram, where they look at how, so post World War II, there was massive strives towards helping humanity, reducing child mortality, increasing standard of living, and capitalism was the big one. But they're looking at now that there's this fourth industrial revolution through technology and vaccines and medical developments that needs to be respected as its own entity. And there's outdated aspects of society, which one of them is neoliberalism, which supports free markets and financial deregulation and fiscal authority. And so they're saying we must rethink what it means by capital, whether it's financial, human, or whatever it is, and change from the fact that consumers just want cheaper and better quality products. And instead they want companies to contribute towards what they call the common good. And they've called it stakeholder capitalism. Stakeholder capitalism, so that everyone is invested in the stake, which is Earth and humanity and itself, and that you as an individual, despite the fact that your company is a $1 billion company that it's built on the back of slave labor, whatever you have, you're actually a factor in this overall overarching, in what you're saying there, is humanity. And if the markets could be changed in order to put the emphasis again on you as the individual in your business dealings are responsible for what's going on in the world, that you're now a stakeholder in society as a whole. And it is a good video, and I will share it to the Instagram. So the shareholders just profits, but stakeholders, it's Klaus Schwab. It's Klaus Schwab wrote the book, Stakeholder Capitalism. No, sorry, Stakeholder. Apologies now again about looking at the phone.
No worries.
Yeah, Stakeholder Capitalism. It's a book, A Global Economy That Works for Progress, People and Planet, by Klaus Schwab. There could be something there. Now, the problem is how do you remove the factor, which is essentially greed, that has driven us to this point? And to strip that out of society is not going to be easy. But can you see any way of doing that? Can you see something before the world collapses, before we have a monumental precipice that we cannot come back from? Is there any way of avoiding a collapse in society?
So I look at that. So obviously these kind of attempts to alter large-scale global economic systems, previous attempts so obviously, like, you look at, there has been disastrous attempts to try and get rid of capitalism and get rid of the markets, which is what communism is represented, which is essentially like the removal of markets and the state control of all resource production allocation.
And it doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. It results in hundreds of millions of people being starved to death or executed. The system doesn't work. Marxism does not work. People need to understand the history of Marxism and where it leads.
Yeah, and at the same time, the other solution is entirely open markets. That's real, like, anarchic libertarianism, where there's just markets and no state intervention, and maybe even no state. That's the other example.
Which is close enough to what America represents.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, by no state, I mean something like Libya with something like wartime Libya, where there's open air slave markets. Or where you can just buy and sell people, buy and sell nuclear weapons, buy and sell human organs, just stuff where, like, where there's no there's just completely free market, so there's a balance that needs to be struck between the government controlling the worst excesses of the market as part of its imposition on society, but then the human individual, we regulate the government if it's a democracy with our voting ability, but then we also interact with the market in terms of what we spend our money on. So there's this kind of loop of the government's job is to regulate the market, the worst excesses of it, so that there aren't child sex slaves being sold or nuclear weapons or whatever being sold just to whoever has the money to buy them.
Mm.
Similarly, it's up to us, if we live in a democracy, to choose which politicians we'd like to be involved in making decisions about how to regulate the market, and also how to provide for people within society that we also live in terms of, do we vote for politicians that are more supportive of taking care of people and that are born into the worst luck, for example. Similarly, but then the market is going to play a role as well, in that we also as individuals have an ability to choose what we spend our money on. What do we partake in terms of because where we spend our money is where we allot power. So where do we choose to spend our money? And where do we choose to place our attention? And where do we choose to place? So I break it down into 3 different kind of categories. This is what I'm writing about, is 3 different ways that I have as an individual. So essentially, I'm looking at it from, just like I wrote the essay, first person. What can I do to take ownership of the situation? So given the fact that I'd rather civilization didn't collapse, or human species didn't go extinct from some kind of Holocaust, or that we don't just end up sleepwalking ourselves into some kind of bizarre techno dictatorship where we're being monitored and everything is being like something that George Orwell couldn't even comprehend in Big Brother, because he wasn't aware of things like maybe like embedded chips that can monitor heart rate variability, that can pay attention to my stress responses in response to some kind of government messaging, that can tell if I'm getting angry or not. And
we can see that coming, such as with the Cyberlink that Tesla has produced.
Well,
Neuralink.
Potentially, like there's a lot of what Elon, the way that there's maybe a different discussion, but a lot of what Elon Musk is doing, I'm really hopeful. Like, I'm really happy that he's actually in that position of being able to, because the Neuralink is more tapping the human brain into the power of what will be these AI algorithms. Yes. Because like an attempt, from my understanding, it's an attempt to embed the human mind within the AI mind, the deep mind. And that's because Elon legitimately has the fear of AI running rampant in a way that we may have designed it to do, but then it's in the completion of its process. That's even before we develop AGI, artificial general intelligence, that it runs off, like we'd said, it maximizes itself. And as a result of it maximizing the task that it was given, it just destroys things, let's say. So Elon is definitely, he's a really forward thinker on these issues. And so, but it's more that my solution that I'm starting with is by, as an individual, taking ownership for the continuation of the species. Not only the continuation of the species, but the maintenance of the freedom to figure out how to live.
And this is a big thing now, because it seems like one of the last defenses we have in society is individual autonomy, and to appeal to people's individual sense of morality and behaviors and decisions to alter it, because it's exhausted now, this concept of, the fact is that big tech survive because you funnel into them, like you're a willing participant in it, and you can condemn them and complain about how they manipulate their data, but at the end of the day, you're playing with the system. They provided it, you're playing with it. They're just going, look, we're just capitalizing off what you're looking for. And I'll show you the t-shirt. Actually, just so happens the one I'm wearing today. So Stop to Demand. What it actually is it's a organization. It's an anti-human trafficking organization that focus on sexual human trafficking. And a big factor of that is porn usage, and how there's a disconnect between the porn that's consumed and the reality that a huge proportion, a massive proportion of porn production is effectively human trafficking. And the fact is that the onus is on you as the consumer. Like, if you really think human trafficking is wrong, you have to take action here. You can't just condemn these companies that are profiting off it. It is you as the individual. And you see, the problem is we deal with these scales. We're talking billions of people engaging with these platforms. And so we think, well, my consumption of it doesn't really play into it. It's too small. And so there's a real issue with appealing to individuals' autonomy to behave better. And as a result, it will force companies to be more ethical. Like, if you disagree with child labor, don't buy Nike, don't buy Gap, don't buy Adidas. But people aren't going to do that. You've got major sports stars that are signing these sponsorships. It's all glamorized. And so we're not going to change it, because on the individual level, we have no desire to change. And when we think of numbers in this scale, this call to individual betterment is lost. It's almost lost in the wind. And how then do you actually get individuals on a global scale to change is what is really a difficult issue. And I don't know how to do it. I'm trying to do it in my own little circle, because you see, it all comes back to, well, first of all, you have to be, and not to, like, this phrase has been beaten to death, you have to be the change you want to see in the world. And the fact is that there's a kernel of truth to that there's more than a kernel. That is true. And within your own circle, you have to try and encourage people not to engage in it. But you, as an individual who is calling for changes, you cannot be seen to be participating in it. And so again, it just comes down to, first and foremost, getting your own house in order before you try and change the world.
I agree with you, man. And that's the thing. It's like, where one of the things that I write to myself is that I can't change anyone, but I can be the change. I write this because it's the only thing that I have control over is my own actions, or at least a sense of control over. That's, you know, in terms of, without going near questions on free will or determinism or any of that kind of stuff, there's a sense that I have a voluntary control over my decisions. And that's all I have control over. And so how I orientate in the world, that's why, so you mentioned, for example, like, people, the sense of powerlessness that someone might have. And it's like, well, I'm only one of billions contributing to this global economic system. What difference does it make if I buy this stuff, that's this cheap product that may or maybe have been made by slave labor, Uyghur Muslims in Northwest China? You know, someone might go, well, what's the difference? And the difference is, like, that's, I think of it like voting. So, like, if I vote in an election, just because I have one vote doesn't mean that I'm less likely to do it. Like, because I'm aware that I'm contributing power somewhere. So then I think of it in terms of social voting, first and foremost. So there's 3 different types of voting that I've kind of broken it down to, in terms of my ability as an individual to elicit, that I can control my own actions. So what kind of change would I like to be, like you referenced the Gandhi quote there, be the change you want to see in the world. So, like, for example, as it relates to resources, or the social voting first, the social voting, resource voting, and attention voting, where attention voting underpins the first 2. The social voting has a formal and an informal aspect. The formal aspect is how I actually orientate in elections, in democratic societies. In non-democratic societies, formal social voting is whether or not I decide to call out or even orientate towards removing a dictatorship. So how do I, if I'm living somewhere where there's a dictatorial government, social voting is, how do I navigate this, given the fact that I'd rather I was able to play a role in who was the political leaders. So if I'm in a dictatorship, but that's a different discussion. I really feel for people who live in somewhere like China, who would like to be able to play a role in deciding their political leadership, but don't get a chance. And so there's formal social voting, and there's informal social voting, which is, how do I choose? Again, I like the word vote, 'cause it starts with, actually, the concept of voting is based on one person, one vote. And it applies across the board then. So then informal social voting is how I choose to interact with other people in an informal sense, socially. How do I cast votes in terms of where do I allot power? And am I choosing to orientate to interact with people such that I'm trying to dominate or to win conversations or to assert my superiority? Or am I trying to interact with other people such that I'm trying to unify so that I'm trying to recognize the absurdity of feelings of intrinsic superiority and how ridiculous and shallow that is. That we're all just these temporarily assembled cluster of borrowed meat suits that happens to have facilitated the emergence of some kind of a consciousness that allows it to be aware of the fact that it is such. You know, we're all in the same boat. So then that's an informal social voting, is how do I engage with other people? Am I trying to win or am I trying to unify? And that awareness then puts out ripples, like it's all ripples of actions. And then there's resource voting, which would be how do I let's say acquire and utilize resources? Like, for example, do I buy food that I allow to go off and then have to throw out? Do I buy things not because I legitimately need it, but because it's a coping mechanism that allows me to feel good because of a short-term dopamine hit? Do I buy clothes, or do I buy just because that may very well be not it's not necessary?
Fast fashion.
Fast fashion, yeah. That I'm feeding into this system. Or am I willing to, or when I do need a t-shirt, am I willing to go, all right, I don't buy t-shirts very often, but when I do get one, I'd like to buy one like the one you have on. That's something that's it's applying power somewhere. Or it might be supporting a company like Patagonia, that like Patagonia literally tell people, don't buy our shit unless you actually need it. Like that's part of their public relations, is they tell people if there's something wrong with a jacket, repair it. Don't buy a new one, or send it to us and we repair it. Yeah, like they're really into environmental protection and conscious capitalism. And then there's attention voting, and the attention voting is where I choose to allot my attention, and that has an internal and an external component. The internal component is where within my own mind and my own processing of information about reality that I find myself, about the reality in which I find myself, where in my own mind do I choose to pay attention? And as it relates to something like human relations and my desire to not contribute to increasing conflict, well, what's most important is that I pay attention to the parts of myself that are going to most likely manifest in anger or feelings of superiority or feelings of or that can lead me to dehumanize someone else, the other, quote unquote. And that's the shadow. It's like the most important place that I pay attention to in my own mind is the places of my own mind that I least want to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And then
as you said, I think it was in the essay as well, the thing you need most is in the place you least want to look.
Yeah, yes, Carl Jung, yeah. And so that's internal attention voting. Where do I choose to allot power with my vote toward my own attention? But internally. And that also is in relation to one other component is my own shadow, but another key component of internal voting is feelings of certainty. Whereas if I'm certain that I'm correct about something, that is beyond absurd, because unless I can have all knowledge that has ever existed anywhere in the universe, that has ever existed or will ever exist, that and even outside of the universe and whatever the universe is, unless I can have absolutely complete knowledge for sure, then how can I know that how can I be certain of anything in terms of about objective reality? It's all shades of gray. So anytime I feel like I am 100% correct and I'm not willing to change my mind, and in light of any evidence, I'm no longer thinking like a scientist. I'm thinking like a religious dogmatist.
Yes.
So they're the two components internally that are absolute key, is paying attention to the shadow and paying attention to feelings of dogmatic certainty. Because those two things relate to how I now relate to the outside external world, which is what do I choose to pay attention to in the external world? And there's positive aspects that I can pay attention to, elements of choosing to pay attention to the beauty of nature or to the simplicity of the love, the just human interaction and my friends and my loved ones, and just choosing to pay attention to how awesome it is to exist at all. Generate some gratitude, but also as it relates to making political decisions or making consumerist decisions in terms of social voting or resource voting, what I pay attention to is going to massively determine that. So internally, obviously, if I'm paying attention internally to shadow and feelings of dogmatic certainty, and that's going to change the lens through which I view external information. So then what I'm paying attention to in other people, let's say politicians, is I'm also looking out for politicians that are willing to speak in shades of gray and are refusing to speak in terms of dogmatic black and white. Because if a politician is speaking in dogmatic black and white, that they're operating as if they're some alpha chimp that's for sure right, and that they know what's going on for sure, then they're almost certainly either unaware of their own ignorance or they're lying to me.
Yeah.
Because certainty is an indication of either ignorance or lies.
I like that. Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
So,
And
the only certainty is uncertainty. That's it.
Coming back, sorry, go ahead.
No, just that's it. That the only certainty is uncertainty. And there's a bit of a paradox to that.
Yeah.
But it's the base floor understanding of reality. Is that when you abandon all, if I abandon all my parochial indoctrinations and kind of ideological groomings that I've been exposed to because I'm where my meat vehicle happened to have been born, all I'm left with in regards to my understanding of external reality is the mystery of existence. That's at a fun. It's just mystery. And after that, it's shades of gray. Like, doesn't mean that I'm a nihilist as it relates to epistemology and knowledge. Like, there's something like scientific method works, and it's illustrated in not only something like this computer conversation we have to take place, but something like GPS satellites actually working only because Einstein's general relativity is more useful description of gravitation than Newtonian celestial mechanics. And if it wasn't for general relativity, the GPS satellites would tell our phones where we were, and it could be wrong up to 11 kilometers a day.
Yeah.
Because so like there are ways of understanding reality that are more accurate than others, but it's still all shades of gray.
Brilliant. Very, very well done. And
I only have a few more minutes here now.
Say again.
I only have a few more minutes here.
Yeah, no, I'm wrapping it up there now. Yeah. I just wanted to make one other point in terms of, as well, dealing with superiority. A simple trick is always speak to people like they've something to teach you. And it's a great way of remaining humble and keeping your mind open. And when they say things, don't assume they're saying it because they're stupid. Assume that they must have given it a bit of thought, and gently ask questions and be like, interesting, I hadn't actually considered that. And how did you come to that conclusion? And not an accusation, not an accusational sort of interrogation, but as a genuine, and I mean the word genuine there, curiosity of, wow, this could be a blind spot. What did I miss? Is there something else for me to learn here? And it's a great way of controlling.
Is that one of Jordan Peterson's 12 rules in the first book?
Is it?
Is it?
He does, yes.
Something like that is one of his 12 rules.
Yes, it is. It is. Well remembered now. I'd actually forgotten that.
Yeah. Something like that is, yeah. It's so powerful though, man. Because you're approaching things but then this is, to be able to do that requires a foundational axiom to me, and that foundational axiom to me is the awareness of my own ignorance.
Yes.
So by catching myself, if I feel like I'm unwilling to let an idea go, or that I feel like I'm right for sure, that's almost certainly a sign that I'm unaware of how ignorant I am. So then if I can catch that, and if I can be aware that I'm just this finite, limited, fallible, irrational, baldy primate figuring shit out as I go along, that allows me to have this base to then interact with other human beings in a way that's grounded in this humility and this awareness that they have this, every human being has this, they have this massively complex understanding of reality and intricate web of desires, hopes, fears, insecurities, traumas, accomplishments, all these things that have generated a unique, totally unique individual. And to view the world like that makes it so much harder to have conflict. It makes it so much harder to engage in arguments as opposed to an orientation towards truth. Instead of trying to defend the belief, it makes it much easier to orientate towards truth rather than just defend beliefs, like in some kind of dogmatic sense.
And on that topic then of learning from other people, let me just thank you again for giving me your afternoon, coming on and being willing to talk about these things. Brilliant topics here. I am very appreciative to you for that. If people want to find out more about you, where can they go?
So recently I deleted, just because there's a different conversation, but in relation to some of the stuff that we talked about earlier on, for kind of largely ethical reasons at the moment, I just decided I couldn't keep going on social media. So I did have social media accounts that no longer exist. So,
well, they exist. They're still being used to collect data from.
Yeah, exactly. But so I have a website, quarrelsomelife.com. And on that website is links to, I must update it actually with some of the new podcasts, but there's links to the podcasts I put out. The two podcasts that I do are Quarrelsome Life Radio and another one called, that's my own one, and then where I do interviews with people and talking about all different topics. Or it's where that Joker podcast is, and that can be found on Spotify, etc. And then the Axiom of the Infinite Unknown is another one I do with that lad James Velitis, my buddy over in England. And there are two places. And then I also have an email kind of newsletter that I used to run, and I'm kicking back up again. That's going to be basically sending out information on these topics. And a lot of the topics we discuss, because they're what interests me the most and seem to be of the utmost importance. And that can be found on the About page of my website. There's a subscriber link there. And if you just go onto the quarrelsomelife.com, in the little bio thing at the beginning on the front page of the website, there's a little bio. There's a link to where the subscriber box is for the email. So Excellent. Anyone who's interested in any of the rambles and thinks that they've had some thoughts simulated, that's where I can be. I can be found. Or if anyone was interested in any actual training stuff, then I can be found on Ciaran at sigmanutrition.com. If they were interested in any of the coaching stuff we talked about earlier on, or finding out any stuff about, especially if they're fighters or whatever. Because I know you had John Mitchell on here before, and maybe some fighters listen to this.
Yeah, there's a lot of physically active people who come on, all right. And I'll when the podcast goes up, I'll make the links available too, and equally we'll direct people on, and we'll continue again. It's all just building and continuing these kind of discussions. So once more, Ciaran, man,
really enjoyed that.
Thank you very, very much for coming on, man.
Absolutely, my pleasure, man. That was great, Craig.
Good. I'll see you later.
Good, buddy.